I'm Leigh Ann Gerrans and you're watching W News broadcasting live from the Al Arabiya headquarters. These are our top stories. America is back and we're just getting started. The US president addresses the US Congress in a historic speech. A summit at the White House, Macron and Starmer prepared to accompany Zelensky to Washington for a second showdown with President Trump as the CIA pours intelligence to Ukraine. Florida launches a criminal investigation into the Tate brothers who touched down in the Sunshine State last week. And the US rejects the Arab leaders' post-war plan for Gaza as Trump stands by his takeover vision. To our top story, and President Trump has given the longest ever presidential speech to US Congress for the first time since his return to the White House. The US president spoke for more than an hour and 40 minutes, breaking the previous record set by President Bill Clinton back in 2000. During his speech, Trump declared the American dream is unstoppable 6 weeks after taking power, from slashing the federal workforce to cracking down on immigration, imposing tariffs on America's biggest traders, and the ongoing talks between the US and Ukraine. He told any doubters he was just getting started. Here's a reminder.
Members of the United States Congress, thank you very much. And to my fellow citizens, America is back. 6 weeks ago, I stood beneath the dome of this Capitol and proclaimed the dawn of the golden age of America. From that moment on, it has been nothing but swift and unrelenting action to usher in the greatest and most successful era in the history of our country. We have accomplished more in 43 days than most administrations accomplished in 4 years or 8 years, and we are just getting started.
We can now go live to Washington to speak to our correspondent, Kate Fisher. Kate, thank you for joining me. A really lengthy address, which also included him reading out a letter from Volodymyr Zelensky, a similar sounding message to the one posted earlier on X.
Yeah, that's right. This was a much more conciliatory tone, really, from President Trump vis-à-vis Ukraine. Obviously, there was that disastrous meeting in the Oval Office last week, but he seemed to be pleased that President Zelensky of Ukraine had reached out to him with this letter that he said he had just received. He said he appreciated it and that he was ready to sign the minerals deal. He kind of suggested that the letter, the content of the letter, was similar to what Mr. Zelensky had put on social media earlier that day. So essentially reiterating Ukraine's commitment to peace, its readiness to get to the negotiating table as soon as possible, and really complimenting the US, which of course is important with Mr. Trump, saying it valued what they had done already and they were ready to work under Mr. Trump's strong leadership. However, Donald Trump didn't share any firm commitments about what will happen next.
And it's been announced that Macron, Starmer and Zelensky will all meet Trump at the White House to discuss the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. And this really comes at a time when the CIA has paused intelligence support to Ukraine. When are we expecting that meeting to take place?
Yeah, that's another blow for the Ukrainians, the announcement that they will no longer be receiving US intelligence. Already there's been a pause in the delivery of US weapons to the Ukrainians. The US really trying to turn the screws on Zelensky, it feels like. In terms of this planned meeting where you would see Prime Minister Starmer of the UK, President Macron of France and President Zelensky of Ukraine all coming to Washington at the same time for a meeting with Trump to try to unveil kind of a blueprint for peace that would perhaps see French and British troops on the ground with some kind of US backstop. That's what we think this blueprint would include. There has been murmurings from Paris that that is on the cards and from Downing Street, but there have been no firm commitments from either about when this could take place. And a French spokeswoman saying that this was at the moment more of a hope and a wish than a firm date in the diary.
And the president shouted out Elon Musk and his Doge team during his speech as that bromance seems to grow. Many were surprised to see how Elon Musk was dressed. All eyes were on this, and he was actually in a suit, wasn't he?
Yeah, it's the first time we've seen him dressed like that since he kind of began working for President Trump. Certainly the first time in public. President Trump hailed him during his speech, applauded the work he was doing. There was no sign of people had predicted that perhaps these two men with large egos and lots of money might end up not getting along quite as well. But certainly Donald Trump gave him a lot of praise in the speech at Congress last night and asked the Republicans and Democrats to thank him too. And he went through many of the what he sees as achievements that Elon Musk has made under the Department of Government Efficiency, which he is heading, and where federal agencies are being gutted, people are being laid off, and many programs have been closed. And Donald Trump ran through several of those, particularly those foreign aid programs. He was fairly dismissive in that list. It took several minutes to go through. He suggested that no one had heard of the African country of Lesotho, for example. So it was, but that got a lot of support from Republicans in the audience. And yes, Elon Musk in a suit and smiling and taking the praise from the president.
And actually looking pretty smart, if I say so myself. But Kate, Trump also mentioned Greenland and his desire for the US to acquire it. We're going to get it one way or another, he said. He's just not letting this idea go, is he?
Yeah, this is clearly really important to him. He made it clear that he would like to not just rule the US, but expand the territory of the US when he came to the presidency. He suggested in this speech that it was going to happen, as you say, and he said that it was vital for national and international security, suggesting this isn't just sort of a personal ambition of his, but that also he sees it as important for balancing out between Russia and China, who also have interests in the Arctic, and he wants to see a strong US presence there. He did say, though, that we strongly support Greenland's right to determine its own future, but if you choose us, we will welcome you into the United States.
Kate Fisher in Washington, thank you so much for that. Let's take a look at some of the other stories making the headlines today. Over 200 protesters have gathered in front of Columbia University in New York against former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, who was visiting the campus. One of the protesting groups said it sent a message that the university values some voices over others. President Trump is threatening to cut federal funding for schools that allow what he sees as illegal protests. Now, North Korea may be close to launching its first airborne early warning aircraft. That's according to satellite imagery, which shows a modified Illusion IL-76 plane parked at Pyongyang Airport. The jet could assist in aerial surveillance, making it a significant upgrade to the Hermit Kingdom's aging Air Force. German defence companies are encouraging the country's ailing auto industry for more building capacity as Europe prepares to raise military spending. For decades, car makers have fueled Germany's economy, but job cuts and factory closures are plaguing the once thriving industry. Experts say a pivot towards defence production could give an injection to Germany's finances. And Emma Raducanu has spoken out about her stalker experience. The British tennis champion said she couldn't see the ball through her tears and could barely breathe after being targeted during the Dubai Open. The man in question was promptly removed by police and also given a restraining order. Now, the Trump administration has rejected plans regarding the reconstruction of Gaza put forward by Arab leaders. The White House responded to a $53 billion alternative idea to Trump's original Gaza takeover, which had included the displacement of Gazans. The U.S. said the president stood by his own vision, which included expelling Palestinian residents and transforming it into the Riviera of the Middle East, which would be owned by the United States. They added the proposal put forward by the Arab nations in Cairo did not address the reality that Gaza is currently inhabitable and somewhere where residents cannot humanely live. We can now go live to Holytsia to speak to author and Middle East correspondent Jotam Confino. Jotam, thank you so much for joining me. Can you provide the details of the Arab leaders' proposal and tell us what objections the Trump administration has to the plans?
Yeah, so let's start with the plan. First of all, it's very comprehensive. And on paper, it looks amazing. It's talking about creating 500,000 new jobs in Gaza. It's talking about building 400,000 housing units that can accommodate 2.7 million people. Industrial zones, agricultural zones will be built. They're talking about building 120 hospitals, a seaport, an international airport. The list is very, very long of amazing initiatives. But one thing that it does not address is Hamas. Hamas is not mentioned a single time in this document that's over 100 pages long. What it does say is that there will be an interim government, a civil administration in Gaza, which will be governed by independent technocrats. And then after 6 months, the Palestinian Authority will take over control with Gaza. But the fact that Hamas is not mentioned once, or even the possibility of removing or disarming Hamas, that is what has led Donald Trump, I believe, to dismiss this plan, because Donald Trump has made it very clear, and so has Israel, that they will not accept any plan of Gaza where Hamas stays in power. So the United States are now saying this is not a viable plan. We need a Hamas-free Gaza, is what they're saying.
What kind of future does Hamas have in Gaza? The US doesn't want them there, like you've just told me, nor does Netanyahu. Hamas has told Al Arabiya they would be willing to step aside if it was kept as an internal matter without regional or international parties' involvement. This does seem unlikely.
It does seem completely unlikely, and Hamas has actually also made it clear a few times that they're not willing to lay down their weapons. And also, why should they? They're back in power now. They control Gaza, and that's what they would like to continue to do. Now, maybe they would be interested in having some sort of a solution where a government includes both the PA and Hamas, but that's not something that Israel wants to accept. So we're at a crossroads here, really, because Hamas is refusing to give up its power. Israel is refusing to Hamas to stay in power. So inevitably, we're going to see the war resume. And this is a failure not only by Israel for not coming up with a plan for the day after, but by the international community as well, to have 16 months of war and not come up with a viable plan to remove Hamas from power.
Has Benjamin Netanyahu responded to either the Arab leaders' plans or to Trump's response? What does he envision for a post-war Gaza? As you said, they haven't come up with a plan.
They haven't. Netanyahu wants to basically do what Trump does, which is he's placing the ball in Donald Trump's court. He's saying, if you want to remove 2 million Palestinians from Gaza, be my guest. That's the best solution for Netanyahu. That's a headache gone for him. But of course, it's unrealistic. If we look at what the foreign ministry said officially in response to this plan initiated by Egypt, then they're saying, rightly so also, that it doesn't address the fact that Hamas is still present. And it also says that it's basically building on outdated ideas to recreate Gaza and to reestablish a good community there that isn't governed by a terrorist organization. So the foreign ministry is completely dismissing this. And they do that because they know that Donald Trump is backing them in this.
We're led to believe that the Arab nation's $53 billion proposal will be presented to Trump in the coming weeks. Any idea of what more we know on this?
I would say that before we can start more specifically about the reconstruction of Gaza, which is obviously a huge undertaking and it's very, very pressing issue, it has to be rebuilt. But before we get there, we need to know if Hamas and Israel are going to continue the ceasefire or if they're going to go back to war, because it looks currently like Israel is about to resume the war with Hamas. Israel wants to expand the first phase of the ceasefire, which Hamas doesn't want to. They want to go straight into the phase 2 of the ceasefire, where Israel is going to remove all of its troops from Gaza, and that's something Israel is not interested in. So unless we continue this ceasefire, there'll be a war, and then you can forget anything about reconstruction. There'll be more death and more destruction in Gaza, and that's obviously something that most people hope we can avoid.
Jotam Confino, author and Middle East correspondent, thank you so much for your insights.
Thank you.
Let's get into this further with former senior CIA officer Robert Grenier. Robert, great to have you on the show tonight. I was just wondering if you could react to what Jotam was actually saying there about the war resuming and there not being any sort of resolution when it comes to Hamas.
Well, I couldn't agree with him more. It's very clear that the Israeli government and Prime Minister Netanyahu will certainly not accept a continuation of Hamas in Gaza, whether in a formal leadership role or standing behind an alternative leadership, as seems to be suggested by the Egyptians. And so it seems almost inevitable that we were going to be returning to active hostilities in the Gaza Strip.
Was it a big surprise to you that Trump and Israel rejected this alternative plan to Gaza by the Arab leaders? Because obviously they've come up with this since Donald Trump said he wanted to turn it into the Riviera of the Middle East.
No, I'm not at all surprised by this rejection. I think the one positive thing that you could say about Trump's analysis of the situation is that he's right in that if we continue to do the same thing over and over again, we're going to end up in precisely the same place. And so for the Arabs to step up and reconstruct Gaza under circumstances where it seems almost inevitable that eventually Hamas will return to resistance, which will then motivate the Israelis to do precisely what they have done on numerous occasions in the past, which is to launch attacks not only on armed resistance, but also on the civilian population and the civilian infrastructure. So I can understand why there would be some reluctance on the part of the Arabs to simply go around this circle once again. So that's the reason, the stated reason why Donald Trump will not support this initiative. But as was just pointed out, there really are no clear alternatives on the horizon.
Robert, but what will this actually mean if Israel resumes its attacks on Hamas? What will it mean for the wider Middle East and the security concerns around that, the stability of the Middle East?
Well, I mean, we've just seen 15 months of active warfare in Gaza, a campaign by Israel that is generally considered by a great many people, myself very much included, as a rolling war crime. and it really hasn't destabilized the Middle East. Now, obviously, we had the actions of the so-called axis of resistance. Their combined reaction to Israel has not been successful. Hezbollah has been greatly weakened in Lebanon. The Iranians have also been greatly weakened, and so it doesn't seem as though there's any real nexus of military opposition to Israel. And absent that, or some sort of compelling and effective resistance to Israeli policy from outside the region, to include the European Union and the United States, it appears as though history is simply going to continue on the same line.
I just want to shift gear a little bit. The US is also ramping up pressure on Ukraine, cutting off intelligence sharing with Kyiv. What kind of ramifications will this have?
I'm sorry, what sort of implications will this have?
What sort of implications will this have for Ukraine if this intelligence sharing is no longer available from the US?
Well, this is a very serious blow to Ukraine. They rely very heavily on U.S. supplied weaponry. The U.S. is certainly by no means the only entity which is providing military support. But U.S. intelligence support for Ukraine is somewhat unique. There's no one else, to include the Europeans, who can provide the same sorts of support. And it's something that is extremely important to their overall war effort. So this is just one more element in what is a clear attempt on the part of Trump and his administration to exert irresistible pressure on the Ukrainians to cave to Russian demands and to make a peace deal that is essentially on their terms.
So do you think that we are close to a peace deal, and do you think Russia does want to negotiate?
Well, that's very much an open question. Right now, it seems to me that it would be very much in the Russian interest to simply allow nature to take its course, to allow the U.S. to ramp up pressure on the Ukrainians, essentially to cave to their demands. I don't think that the Russians want to bargain against themselves at this point. But I think the overall outline of at least an interim solution acceptable to them is relatively clear, and I think that they are counting on the U.S. to deliver that to them.
And in other news, Florida has launched a criminal investigation into the Tate brothers. The state's governor has said they're not welcome, but they've had back saying they're innocent. What do you make of all of this?
Yeah, it's really kind of an extraordinary situation. Now, it's true that the Tates haven't been convicted in any jurisdiction thus far. It was not at all anticipated that they would be able to leave Romania, where they are under active investigation and have been indicted. It appears, the situation is very unclear, but it appears that it was a roving envoy of Mr. Trump's, Richard Grenier, who intervened with Romanian authorities to get them to release these individuals with the provision that they needed to return to court, I believe, on the 24th of March. So this is really quite extraordinary. Clearly, Governor DeSantis of Florida is not particularly happy with it. He seems to find the charges against these people somewhat compelling, at least to the point of allowing a local investigation to go forward. But the fact that these people were released from Romania and allowed to return to the United States, where, after all, they do have citizenship, is really quite an extraordinary turn. Trump himself is saying that he knows nothing about it, but it appears to have at least some of his fingerprints on it.
Robert Grenier, former senior CIA officer, thank you so much for talking to me.
You're very welcome.
Let's take another look at some of the other stories making the headlines today. French President Emmanuel Macron has announced he'll address the nation later this evening. In a statement released on X, he said, "In this moment of uncertainty, where the world is confronted by large challenges, I will address you tonight." It comes as Europe's leaders prepare to meet tomorrow at an emergency summit on Ukraine and European defence. At least 12 people have been killed after a pair of suicide bombers drove vehicles filled with explosives into a security installation in Pakistan. The blast also blew the roof of a nearby mosque by a market. Security forces did manage to stop the militants from entering the military facility, and 6 of them were killed. 2 Philippine Air Force pilots have been killed after their aircraft crashed during a mission in Bukidnon province. The Philippine Air Force have said the FA-50 fighter lost contact shortly after midnight, prompting a search and rescue operation. The wreckage of the jet and the 2 pilots were found in the Kalaltungan Mountains. And the plans to mark the 80th anniversary of Victory in Europe Day, also known as VE Day in Great Britain, have been announced. Residents have been asked to celebrate the occasion with street parties. A flypast involving the iconic Red Arrows, military processions and concerts will also take place. VE Day is celebrated on the 8th of May each year to mark the day the Allies formally accepted Germany's surrender in 1945. Pope Francis rested well last night and woke up slightly earlier this morning, according to the Vatican. The 88-year-old Pope is currently receiving treatment for bilateral pneumonia at Rome's Gemelli Hospital. Today, he continued to have non-invasive mechanical ventilation, with his clinical condition remaining stable. I'm now joined by international lawyer and also church consultant, Dr. Harry Hagopin. Harry, good evening to you. Thank you so much for joining me again. Firstly, tell us about this non-invasive mechanical ventilation and how long are we expecting the Pope to be treated with it?
Well, good evening, Leigh Ann. It's difficult for me to guess how long he's going to be treated. Remember, he's been there for almost at the Gemelli Hospital for almost 3 weeks. And what they've been doing is most of the time it's been non-invasive. Non-invasive means for anybody who's been to hospital or found himself or herself in a hospital bed, they would simply put a mask on your face with some mildly high pressure high flow oxygen in order to help the patient to breathe more easily. It turns to invasive, and it's happened a couple of times when the Pope had acute respiratory failure, where they basically stick a tube through the nostrils and goes down into the windpipe in order to help him breathe more easily, particularly since he had an accumulation of mucus in the endobronchial tubes, and therefore that was preventing him from breathing properly. And remember, he's 88 years old. He's an old man who has had a very hard life. And for the last 13 years that he's been a pope, he's been working quite hard. People don't realize how hard a worker he is. And therefore, they're now pretty much trying to make sure that nothing untoward or more untoward, if you want, happens, so that gradually his lungs begin to get rid of the infection and he begins to breathe more easily on his own. But that's not yet happened.
And also, today is Ash Wednesday. We know the Pope missed the run-up to Lent and will be missing today's service too. Who will be taking his place?
Well, Ash Wednesday is something that Christians and particularly Catholics across the whole world celebrate. It's the beginning of the Lent period, the 40 days that leads to the feast of Easter. And today, usually the Pope is the one who leads the procession on Ash Wednesday. But given what we know, one of the cardinals, in this case it was Cardinal Angelo De Donatis, one of the Italian cardinals who's responsible for one of the departments at the Vatican, he's the one who led the procession. One of the things that I always tell associates and friends when they express concern about how is the Vatican coping with the Pope being at Gemelli for 3 weeks in a rather serious situation, I always tell them that the Vatican is like an 8-cylinder car. It goes on quite well, and if one driver is not there, another driver can handle the car. So they have default options, and today was one example of that default option taking place.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I'm sure the Vatican is run extremely well. But what do we know about his instructions if his health declines? What does the Catholic faith allow?
Well, you know what, Leigh Ann, I mean, one of the things, I was having a chat with a friend earlier today in a coffee shop, and inevitably the question, as is on the minds of a lot of people, was, Harry, what do you think is wrong? What is the damage? What's happening to the Pope? And I said to him, you know what I said? I heard somebody on an Italian channel saying that, how should I put it? You have a fire in your house. You manage to put out the fire, but the question doesn't stop there. The question is then, how much damage has that fire caused? And this is what the specialists and the doctors at Gemelli Hospital are trying to figure out, because the level of the damage and the level of how well he will be able to get out of this infection, this respiratory failure that he's had, and the infection of you called it a bilateral pneumonia, which basically means that he's got the infection in both lungs. And given that one of the lungs has part of it removed when he was young and had an inflammation, a pleurisy, what will happen is it is a question of can he resume his function, his ministry as a pope. And that is where people are saying there are three options. And I'm being a little bit of a prophet here, so forgive me. One is that he reestablishes himself, he gets well, he goes and, as an 88-year-old could do, assumes his position as Pope again. That, to me, at the moment is unlikely. The other one is that he will go into convalescence if he manages to get out of hospital, because he's had a pretty bad knock, and that could be a short convalescence or a long convalescence. And on the basis of that one, I believe, and there is precedent with Pope Benedict XVI before him, that he might decide suddenly, unpredictably, because he's quite an opinionated man, he might decide to resign. And of course, the worst situation is if it's not a resignation or recovery, that it's death, in which case the Vatican will go into mourning, and then there will be a consistory, a meeting of all the cardinals from all over the world who will come. And as some of your viewers might have seen in that wonderful film, Conclave, they will then elect a new pope. So these are the three options that are open at the moment. Which one will it happen? It depends how much damage the fire will cause.
Well, you can always be a prophet on my show, Dr. Harry Hagopin, international lawyer.
My pleasure, Leigh Ann.
Yes, love having you on, and church consultant. Thank you once again for joining me. Let's take a look at the top business news. China is prioritising consumer spending ahead of technology and economic worries weigh on the economy. Encouraging reluctant consumers to spend has been elevated to the top of Beijing's agenda for this year, as lawmakers look to rectify imbalances in the world's second largest economy. During his speech at the annual meeting of the country's parliament, Chinese Premier Li Qiang said China is looking to boost consumption to meet 5% growth goal in 2025. The Hong Kong-based company CK Hutchinson Holding has agreed to sell most of its stake in its 2 ports on a Panama Canal to a group led by US investment firm BlackRock. The sale comes after President Donald Trump said the US should take control of the major shipping route and complained it was under Chinese control. The company said it would sell its interests as part of a deal worth $22.8 billion. Turning to sports news now. LeBron James has become the first player in the NBA to reach the momentous milestone of 50,000 points. James reached the record after hitting a three-pointer in the first quarter of the Lakers' win over the Pelicans in Los Angeles on Tuesday night. At the age of 40, he has already solidified his place as the NBA's all-time leading scorer in both regular season and playoff games. And Arsenal will derive a great deal of confidence from their 7-1 thrashing of PSV Eindhoven in the first leg of the Champions League last 16 tie on Tuesday. Manager Mikel Arteta says the Premier League club are determined to keep the momentum rolling. Arsenal's biggest away win in a European club competition puts them in a position to advance to the quarter-finals, where they'll meet either Atletico Madrid or Real Madrid. Now, a reminder of our top stories. America is back and we're just getting started. The US president addresses a US Congress in a historic speech. A summit at the White House, Macron and Starmer prepared to accompany Zelensky to Washington for a second showdown with President Trump as the CIA pours intelligence to Ukraine. Florida launches a criminal investigation into the Tate brothers who touched down in the Sunshine State last week. And the US rejects the Arab leaders' post-war plan for Gaza as Trump stands by his takeover vision. And that's all from us on W News. Thank you so much for joining us. Riz Khan is coming up next. And of course, don't miss Tom Burges Watson with GNT. Good night and thank you for joining me.
At Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Arabiya News.
It's very impressive.
Where knowledge meets perspective.
Hello and welcome, I'm Riz Khan. This episode of the show continues my fascinating conversation with the highly outspoken best-selling author and evolutionary behavioral scientist, Dr. Gad Saad. In the first part, he took us through the risks presented by what he calls the parasitic mind, based on his widely popular book of the same title, exploring how human thought processes can give up rational ideas to support irrational ideologies. In this episode, the professor turns his critical lens to Islam, a religion he considers to be a major threat to peace and stability in the world. As I spoke with him in his hometown in Montreal in Canada, he justified his concerns, pointing to what he sees as a huge influx of Muslim immigrants into the city.
Could I have predicted, based on the immigration patterns in Montreal, whether Jew hatred was going to go up or go down in Montreal? It doesn't take a fancy professor to give you that prognosis, right? Or that prediction. Well, and the reality is there's been an orgiastic, exponential increase in Jew hatred in Montreal. And it's largely driven by the fact of these demographic changes. So We have to be able to say that openly without being accused of Islamophobia.
Professor Saad also previewed the concept in his upcoming book, Suicidal Empathy, where he posits that irrational support for policies such as open border immigration is behind the increasing destabilization of societal cohesion. Talk a little bit about the ostrich parasitic syndrome. I found this quite interesting.
Yes, so that's chapter 6. So there I'm using the metaphor of the ostrich that buries its head in the sand to avoid reality.
Which, as you say, they don't actually do.
Which I was going to say, which they don't do, but everybody now understands this as an apt metaphor of going la la la, I don't want to hear it. And so in the book, I say that that's a really very dangerous malady, because to my earlier point about never being willing to change your opinion about something despite the incontrovertible facts that I am showing you, that's a manifestation of ostrich parasitic syndrome. So, and the example that I give to demonstrate that is I start looking at what Westerners have come up with to explain the real cause of, say, a terror attack. So Bill Nye, the science guy, when the Bataclan terror attack happened in Paris, where, you know, they say Allahu Akbar and they invoke this particular Quranic verse and so on, he said, no, that was due to, it was very conceivable that it was due to climate change. And then he gives you a causal explanation for how that attack was due to lack of solar panels or too much carbon emissions. That's ostrich parasitic syndrome. Ostrich parasitic syndrome is thinking that the Brussels attackers, I think, that committed the attack there, had been lacking in the exposure to art. I mean, who amongst us didn't see enough Chagall and Picasso and end up going to put bombs because, you know, I'm just missing art? So it's so laughable, it's so silly, because in this case, you view it as instinctually wrong to ever blame it on an ideology, on a religion. And therefore, you'll bury your head in the sand, you'll come up with alternate explanations, even though the perpetrators are telling you why they're doing it. That's what OPS is.
I will get on to religion and ideology, because
Sure.
that's a big part of your book as well.
Sure.
And quite a controversial part.
Mm-hmm.
I know you've had a lot of feedback about. To what degree is the problem that perhaps though the mainstream media, including influential entertainment platforms, act as an echo chamber for the progressivism or the woke culture? How hard is it to battle something that is now so entrenched? I mean, they've actually made rules about what certain movies and adverts and should feature.
Well, look, so let me give an analogy from evolutionary medicine, and you'll see I'll tie it back all together. So in evolutionary medicine, we know the following. If you take children who grew up in a very allergen-free environment, sterile environment, you have OCD parents that are always cleaning. There's no dust, there's no pet dander, versus kids who've grown up in environments where these allergens are present. The latter kids end up having fewer autoimmune diseases, say, for example, asthma, precisely because the immune system expects to be challenged by these allergens in order to optimally function. So then I take that principle and I say the human mind has also evolved to be exposed to opposing ideas, ideological allergens. That allows me to hone my debating skills. If I'm never challenged on anything that I ever say, I can't present the optimal message that hopefully will persuade you, because I've never had any feedback, any blowback, right? So now I come to your question. If I live in an echo chamber, say a journalistic echo chamber, where 90% of the people are fully on board with anything that I say, then there is no allergen that says, wait a minute, I think what you're saying there is complete BS, right? Look at academia. So I discuss in the parasitic mind, these are studies by other folks, where they looked at the political orientation of professors at top universities in the United States. Riz, it's astonishing. Now, let me explain some numbers. In science, if you say that something has an effect of a 1.2 odds ratio, it would be like, if let's say I'm checking the pharmaceutical efficacy of a drug. So 1.2, so it's a placebo versus an actual drug. 1.2 to 1 means that it's 20% more effective. So 1 to 1.2 is a big number. What if I tell you it's 1 to 80. So that's not even, I mean, you don't even pick that up in science. It's such a, now, why am I saying this? In many disciplines, the ratio is 37 to 1, 130 to 1, meaning that sociology departments, you're as likely to see a conservative Republican sociologist as you are to see a dog with wings flying. That's not good. Why? Because if you're a student, there are certain topics of discussion that you would really be enriched to hear both sides. Is the death penalty ever moral? Should we be an isolationist or an interventionist cult? And there are very valid arguments on both sides of the political aisle. Political orientation doesn't matter in neuroscience because the way neurons fire is the way neurons fire, irrespective of what your political orientation is. But in sociology, in anthropology, in some fields of psychology, and economics, having a greater exposure to more ideas can only benefit me, certainly as a student. And so we're literally cheating our students by creating this kind of sterile environment.
With the parasitic mind, I was actually surprised how many times to which you referred back to the state of educational institutions and so on. I mean, you know, it's not something I would ever have had a perspective on. But you seem to think it's really bad.
It's horrifying. Look, and in the parasitic mind, I only gave a few examples of letters that were sent to me from people who, for whatever reason, had broken some sacred cow. So I'll give you one example. Some graduate student writes to me, I'm paraphrasing, I don't have the exact quote, "Dear Professor Saad, my supervisor with whom I've been working on this paper for 2 years has decided to take off my name off the paper because he heard that I said something positive about Donald Trump, and now I fear that I have no future here. Are you accepting doctoral students?" Now, that student wasn't writing to me from Yemen or North Korea or communist China. He was writing to me from a major North American university. Is that the kind of environments we want to be fostering in universities? I don't think so.
How does it affect you as an academic to be able to go out and say things the way you say? I mean, I know you've said tenure doesn't give you like total protection.
It doesn't protect me from death threats.
Right.
Look, it doesn't affect me in the sense that I never modulate my speech as a function of careerist concerns. And I'll tell you why. I have a very exacting code of personal conduct. I'm my worst critic, meaning that at the end of the day, when I'm putting my head on the pillow to sleep, the only thing that will stop me from tossing and turning in insomnia is if I was fraudulent in defending the truth. If I wasn't the guy that when I heard the old lady screaming, I didn't intervene. So if I ever say, I better not say this because maybe this will be the consequence, maybe I'm being too harsh on myself, I would feel as though I'm being fraudulent. How could I be the truth defender if I ever modulate what I truly consider to be the truth? And so therefore, I've never modulated. I don't care.
So you've never not hit post on the button?
I never not hit the post. Never. It's not a reflex that I have. Listen, Riz, literally on any given morning by 10 o'clock, I have posted more controversial stuff than all other academics alive combined. It's just, I don't care. Now, it's not I don't care because I'm an irreverent a-hole who doesn't care about people's feelings, but because you need people in academia to be willing to say what, by the way, the silent majority agrees with me. So I could show you millions of emails from truckers and corrections officers and policemen and majors in the Canadian Army and other professors who say, thank you that you exist. I would have lost my mind if you were not around. So I'm not saying this to pat myself on the back, but you have to be a truth teller. And that's why you get invited to Elon Musk's house.
Well, so you're getting these kind of responses. Do you feel it's having any real impact on the situation the way you see it?
I mean, not only because of me. I mean, there aren't too many people in academia who do what I do, but Donald Trump does it. Elon Musk does it. There are a few people in high positions of power that are irreverent honey badgers. Joe Rogan doesn't. Why did Joe Rogan become Joe Rogan? People have asked me this. Because he is fearless. He's willing to speak to anybody. There is no topic that he's not willing to address. He's intellectually curious. He's engaged. Why didn't Kamala Harris agree to go? Because she can't go and be her authentic self for 3 hours with a guy that he's never given me a script of what we're going. We just press the button and off we go. We may talk about Bigfoot or we may talk about psychology of decision making. I have no idea where we're going. Well, it takes a strength of character to be able to be sufficiently confident to sit in front of a camera where 20 million people are going to consume this without knowing what's coming at you. The reason why he can do it and I can do it is because we're authentic people. And so be authentic. By the way, in the book Between Suicidal Empathy and Parasitic Mind, which is called The Sad Truth About Happiness, right, I have a whole section on what the ancient Greeks already told us. Know thyself, be authentic. And so I try to live with full authenticity.
Does that controversial position risk at all you not becoming James Bond?
Did you see me tagging Jeff Bezos?
Yeah, I saw that lovely picture there of you.
Yeah. By the way, people think that was AI. It's not. It's not a real photo.
No, of course I know.
Yeah. No, but some people thought it was real.
Right. Yeah. No, it's amazing. It just looked. You looked a bit too comfortable with that Aston Martin.
Well, so Jeff Bezos, who's the head of Amazon, I think the next James Bond is being done through Amazon Studio. I hope I'm not misspeaking. And so to play along,
that's right.
I tagged him and I said, "You're looking for the next James Bond." Now, here's the question for you, the really important question. Can I pull off being James Bond at my current height? Yes, I'm astonishingly good looking, but am I tall enough to be James Bond? Give the right answer, Riz.
Well, I mean, look, there are presets. They say president, how many bald presidents have there been in the US? And there's so many of these characteristics people analyze. I was just thinking, as the kind of person you are, you could shoot first and ask questions later then.
Exactly. And by the way, so we've had my daughter who's sitting here off camera grew up, and my other child, they've grown up with Belgian Shepherds. Who are you familiar with Belgian Shepherds? Right. So Belgian Shepherds are usually the dogs that are used in all the military.
So the
Malinois, the Malinois are one of four types of Belgian Shepherds, and so they grew up with these Belgian Shepherds. And I always say, to your point about shoot first, ask questions later, our male, his motto in life was he attacks everything in sight, and then he worries about the consequences later. So maybe that's why I picked them.
Yeah, it's a German Shepherd Alsatian, as I grew up calling them. So there'll be no double oive. Now, for those very wary of that woke culture and the situation the way it is, there is a reluctance to speak out. You've spoken out quite a lot when it comes to religion and Islam in particular, and that's caused a lot of debate. Of course, you defend yourself and say, I'm not Islamophobic. But there is a tone in the way you describe things that make it sound like you believe all Muslims are bad. Sure. It sounds like that. And I know you do say, no, not all Muslims are bad, but it sounds like that.
Look, the distribution of goodness and badness is not limited to one group. There are demonic Jews and there are lovely Jews. There are horrible Muslims. There are lovely Muslims. It's nothing dispositional, right? It's not Jews are kind or evil, Christians are, right? So individuals, I hold no ill will towards anybody. I'm friends with more Muslims than probably most people will ever meet in their lives. How could that have happened if I think that all Muslims, right? On the other hand, I'm also shaped by reality. So let me give you a few examples that might help. We had to escape Lebanon because of which religion? My parents were kidnapped and tortured by which religion? My Syrian ancestors left Syria because of which religion? My brother-in-law's family left Egypt because of which religion? My wife's family in Lebanon had to leave. They're Armenian because of which religion? Their ancestors escaped the Armenian genocide because of which religion? So certainly I can put together in a nomological network that reality while recognizing that individual Muslims might even go out of their way to defend me, right? And they're perfectly noble and kind and peaceful. Islam, though, is a set of ideas that are codified. And then we could say, does Islam promote greater personal liberties and freedoms? Yes or no? There is only these answers. It's either yes or it's no, right? I would venture that based on historical facts, it doesn't promote greater personal liberties and freedoms. And so I can't be Islamophobic in saying that. It's a nonsensical term, as I recently had a conversation with Piers Morgan. I am a Islamo-realist. I recognize that the great majority of Muslims, like in any other grouping, are perfectly lovely, but the codified ideology of Islam, does it promote individual dignity? No.
The nomological record you quoted, though, sounded more like personal baggage.
Right.
So it sounds like, you know, it's your own kind of...
I'm informed by my personal history, but I can share the data from realities that have nothing to do with me, and it's not going to be a good outcome for Islam.
Could you not look at all religions, though, at the basic root in, you know, having come from centuries ago, or even millennia ago, as having certain characteristics that could equally be compared? You know, when you say when it comes to freedoms and so on.
No. So, for example, badminton is a sport and MMA fighting is a sport. They're both called sports. The likelihood of my getting a head injury is not the same in badminton as it is in MMA fighting, even though they're both called sports, right? So the content of religions matter. If you are a Jain, and a practicing Jain, by definition, because of the codified content in Jainism, you're a pacifist. As a matter of fact, you're so much of a pacifist that as you walk down the street, you walk with a broom, lest you might inadvertently step on an ant. So an extremist Jain is one who is extremely peaceful, right? On the other hand, if you're Jewish, then you're not going to eat shrimp or pork. If you are Christian, you're going to eat the prosciutto sandwich. So there are real consequences to the content of what's codified in those books. Now, Islam is a proselytizing religion. It says that there are two binary encampments of the world. There is Dar al-Islam and Dar al-Harb. Dar al-Harb is the house of war. Any land that is not yet under Islamic dominion is one that inshallah will be conquered. Now, is there 1400 years of history that supports that edict? I would venture yes. There are 56 countries that are members of the OIC today that once upon a time were not Islamic. On the other hand, Judaism really sucks at expansionism, right? It's a terribly bad marketing religion because it can't seem to attract new customers. Why? Because it's not a proselytizing religion. As a matter of fact, it's forbidden to convert others. As a matter of fact, if Riz Khan wants to become Jewish, the theological position is you should be dissuaded because that's an honest measure of your desire to become Jewish. On the other hand, in Islam, you just say the Shahada publicly and voila, you're now Muslim. So Islam is a brilliant religion when it comes to expansion. Judaism is the exact opposite of brilliant. So I talk about the ideas behind the religion, never about the individuals.
But isn't there a danger, and I know you've addressed this before as well, but just for our audience, of mistaking cultural behavior for what is actually religious behavior?
Of course, although these tend to go together. I mean, culture doesn't evolve out of a vacuum. By the way, if people ask me, for example, what am I will, my first instinct is to say I'm Lebanese. So I'm very, very much wedded and proud of my Arabic culture, right? My mother tongue is Arabic. The food that we eat is Arabic. I've tried to make my children listen to the Arabic music that I grew up with in Lebanon, right? There are many elements of the Middle Eastern culture that are uniquely beautiful. The culture of hospitality is true. I mean, yes, there are many cultures that have hospitality, but really, the orgy of hospitality of a Middle Eastern home is something gorgeous, right? And so, yes, we can debate which parts are due to culture, which parts are due to religion, but you know, it would take someone that truly suffers from ostrich parasitic syndrome to say that there's absolutely no evidence that Islam has ever done anything incorrect historically.
I don't think people would necessarily argue that, but what I got the sense from the parasitic mind is you're equating Islam to essentially the Middle East. And the reality is that there's only a small minority, technically, of Muslims who are from the Middle East. You have Kazakhstan, you have Indonesia,
of course, Of course, and depending on, you're right, depending on the cultural ecosystem, then the manifestation of the religion will take a different shade. So you're exactly right. It is an interaction. So I concede that point. But again, if we link it to, say, immigration patterns, look, Montreal, where we're sitting right now, is a place that I moved to from the Lebanese Civil War in 1975. From 1975 to 1998. And the reason why I remember it is because it was sort of an episodic memory for me. In 1998 was the first time that I ever saw a woman veiled. So from 1975 to 1998, I never saw it. From 1998 to today, I could walk out of my house, 5 out of the first 10 women that I see are veiled. Now, most of those women are obviously not bad people and are perfectly lovely, and they want to sit down and have hummus with me. That's fine. But the reality is, could I have predicted, based on the immigration patterns in Montreal, whether Jew hatred was going to go up or go down in Montreal? It doesn't take a fancy professor to give you that prognosis, right? Or that prediction. Well, and the reality is there's been an orgiastic, exponential increase in Jew hatred in Montreal. And it's largely driven by the fact of these demographic changes. So we have to be able to say that openly without being accused of Islamophobia.
Isn't though it important to look at, say, the root causes now in many cases, perhaps, and yes, you pointed out that Jews have been persecuted through the centuries. So it dates back way beyond any modern conflict. But a lot of the time, the misrepresentation, I guess, even in the media, is that the Israeli-Palestinian situation is a Muslim-Jewish thing. Well, technically, it's more a land issue. I mean, there are roots based in it. But the danger in equating these two is that suddenly it becomes all Muslims against all Jews. It can become like that. So don't you have to be a little careful not to kind of promote that idea?
Yeah, although I respectfully would disagree with the idea that it's actually a land issue. I think it's very much of a theological issue. Golda Meir, I'm paraphrasing her, said that when the Palestinians love their children more than they hate ours, there'll be peace. She also said that if we lay down our arms, there'd be a massacre. If they lay down their arms, there'd be peace. The idea that I grew up in the Middle East, and I explained it in the Parasitic Mind, when Gamal Abdel Nasser died, the pan-Arabist Egyptian president, and Lebanese people take to the street lamenting his death, and the number one scream that they say is death to Jews, explain to me what is the reflex by which coming down the street from where I lived, screaming death to Jews, is a reflection of the land battle in Israel. We had nothing to do with Israel. We're not Israeli. We're Lebanese. We've always been in Lebanon. We speak Arabic. Why death to Jews? They didn't say death to Zionists.
Yeah, I think, well, that's the reason that generally in the media it's mixed up and people don't differentiate between Zionists and Jews. And a lot of that mixed messaging means now, for example, saying anything against Israel, whether it's not against Jewish people as such, though I know Israel is primarily, is seen as anti-Semitic. And this is where, there seems an imbalance in how people can address issues. Now, if you say everyone should be fearless and say the truth, then people should be able to talk about Israel without being labeled anti-Semitic.
I completely agree, by the way, with what you just said. It is a complete canard to say that any criticism of Israel is tantamount to anti-Semitism. That can't be, right? In no different a way than criticizing some policy that the Mongolian government has come out with is an attack on on Mongolian people. So I'm not a proponent of that. As a matter of fact, I'm so much, by the way, of a free speech absolutist, as you probably know. I support the right of Holocaust deniers to spew their nonsense. What could be more offensive, I mean, literally by definition, than to reject the Holocaust, the systematic erasure on an industrial scale level of an entire people? But in a free society, you have to tolerate falsehood spreaders. You have to tolerate racists and bigots and anti-Semites. I think the problem in the Middle East is that it is a part of one's identity to despise the Jew. Does that mean everybody's like that? No. But I grew up with that. I lived it. I interact with those people. I'll give you a great...
Please. Go.
This is a story that I've only mentioned a few times, but it's going to be in suicidal empathy. First semester at Cornell, doctoral student, I became friends with a bunch of Arab guys playing soccer all the time. As you would expect, we all love soccer. We all met, most of them were Lebanese. At one point, one of those guys asked me to go out for coffee. So I went out with him for coffee. As we sat there, I'm wondering what he wants to, because we hadn't hung out socially. Gad, you're a very smart guy. So thanks. How come you haven't converted yet to the true faith? So then I said, this is not going to go well if that's what we're here for. So then he kind of realized that that's not going to go well. Then he kind of pauses and he kind of looks into the air, a bit conflicted, and goes, Gad, I really like you. I said, why do you say that with some hesitancy? Oh, I know. Is it because I'm Jewish? And he goes, no, but come on, you're not really a Jew. I said, no, I'm a Jew. But what did he mean by that? He had an exemplar of the type of person that he has to hate as a Jew. But this guy is Lebanese. He speaks Arabic. He plays soccer better than all of them combined. That doesn't fit the exemplar of the Jew that I was taught to hate. So it's that reflex that you have to get rid of. Once the Middle East gets rid of that kind of hatred, it will flourish in ways that are unimaginable to both of us.
And I go back to the fact that your reference point is the Middle East and a personal experience with it. Isn't the danger, though, if you're going to talk about Islam in a generic way, like as you have in the parasitic mind, that people in Indonesia, in Kazakhstan, places where they don't necessarily have a kind of real reference point for the Middle East, except the fact they share the religion, that they will start to feel, kind of disenfranchised and then perhaps emotionally against Jewish people.
Well, and that's why I say that it really depends on the context.
There is also the interpretation that is often taken wrongly, which we see in all religions as well. Isn't the danger, though, that what's being done is being done politically? I mean,
by whom?
And even many Muslims would argue it's not being done religiously, the extremists.
Right.
That they might use the name of Islam to do what they do, but it's a political thing. A lot of the stuff that happens is political. Isn't it important to address that? Is what I'm saying.
Of course, although 90% of Islam is political Islam. So people, for example, I did a whole show once on Islam versus Islamism. There is no such thing. As a matter of fact, Erdogan literally said that. There is no radical Islam. There is no militant Islam. There's no extremist Islam. There is no Islamism. There's just Islam, right? And I could show you 100 other imams who said the exact same thing. Islam, again, is a codified set of ideas. Islamism is within Islam. There is a spiritual element of Islam. There's a political element of Islam. As a matter of fact, in Islam, there is great concern for the kuffar, for the non-believer, because again, we need to convert those guys, right? Judaism is live and let live. That's why it never grows, because you don't bring in new adherents to the faith, right? So imagine if now Islam said, look, we're going to get rid of all the expansionism. No more supremacy, no more. We're going to truly adopt a message of live and let live. Then all of the beauty of Islamic society can truly flourish, because I'm the first to understand Islamic poetry, Islamic architecture, the era of Islamic science. So it's not as though there aren't an incredible number of things within that cultural trajectory that we can be proud of.
The reason I'm getting into or sticking with the idea that it's the politics that drive so much is that you don't see, people from Kazakhstan, and I use that as an example because I know the country and it's a Muslim country, or largely Indonesia, any of these countries where the people behave in any radicalized way that has an impact on Western nations. That's why I'm wondering where your reference point is very much the Middle East and the politics of the Middle East that result in what we're seeing a lot of the time.
That's true. As I said, depending on the ecosystem, different variants of the manifestation of Islam will take place, right? So it's not as though in every Islamic country they're going around beheading everybody who's not Muslim. Look, we were fine in Lebanon until we weren't. It's the shingles analogy, right? It's there. But is there an Islamic society, including the more tame ones, where a non-Muslim can become the top person? Can a Jew become the president of Kazakhstan? That would be a manifestation of complete plurality and multiculturalism. So the fact that a society that is Islamic doesn't go around beheading everybody in sight, to me, is not really an impressive thing. Truly impressive would be in the same way that we allow in the West for thousands of mosques to be built because we are so kind and compassionate, let's see the reciprocal kindness in Islamic societies. Let's see a flourishing of endless churches, Buddhist temples, and Jewish temples, synagogues, and then we will have true equality.
I think it's happening in places. I mean, you know, my base is Dubai, and I see, you know, temples and churches and everything.
Inshallah.
Yeah. I'm not a theological expert, so I wanted to get your perspective on it, because I know you've spoken very strongly about it, and I wanted to raise the counter arguments I hear about how you address this, because I think it is quite important that the debate is out there, and I know it's a sensitive one, so people do get very touchy about it, and I know you get a reaction to a lot of it. What's going to come up? Let's move on to your next piece of work now. You're going to go on to the suicidal empathy, and how it ties into what you've done in the parasitic mind, because I understand it's expanding on the ideas and thoughts of that.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So the parasitic mind looks at what happens to our cognitive system when it is parasitized. Remember earlier I talked about thoughts versus feelings. So it's a two-pronged attack to zombify us. First, I need to zombify your thought process. That's the parasitic mind. But then I need to zombify your emotional system. Now I've really got you zombified. Now you really are the spider that is being taken haplessly into the burrow, right? Exactly. So that's what suicidal empathy does, is it completes the story, and it says that I need to hijack both your thought processes and your emotional system to then render you zombified. And so that's the point of suicidal empathy. And then what I do in the book is I demonstrate how many disastrous public policy decisions stem from suicidal empathy. So let's take, say, our views on criminality. When, say, you decide that a felon, you know, it's not fair that we don't give him a second chance. And by second chance, it means that he's been arrested 87 times before. That is suicidal empathy. Now, where does it come from? It comes from the progressive view that criminals, to the extent that they are criminals, and especially if they have melanin that's a bit darker, it can't be because they are inherently criminals, because there are natural variations across individuals in terms of how they acquire resources. It must be because society failed them, right? So what is the point of you putting in prison a criminal when he's already been victimized by society, right? That's not, I mean, life is about cause and effect. If you rape someone, you should be punished severely. If you kill someone, now, by the way, to some extent, maybe it's too harsh, Sharia law understands this very well, right? Because it is very, I mean, if anything, it is actually more wedded to human nature than the progressives. You know, it might be better to be under Sharia law.
You're waving a flag for Islam.
Now, there you go. You see what a good guy I am. So no, but my point is that legal codes have to be rooted in an understanding of human nature. When there are no consequences to all of your bad deeds, is it any surprise that criminality is going to go up? So, for example, when San Francisco, you probably remember this, puts out a thing that says, we're not going to penalize any theft that is under $950. Do you need a fancy evolutionary behavioral scientist to tell you what's going to happen? I mean, it's cause and effect. So what I do in suicidal empathy is I go through domestic policies, foreign policies, all of which result in disastrous consequences because of the misfiring of empathy.
What's your thought on the way that things like the suicidal empathy is being enhanced by social media, by the term bleeding heart liberal is an interesting one. I'll tell you why, because that's the first thing that came into my mind when you said the way you described it. I came from Britain to America when I moved from one channel to another, and liberal in Britain didn't mean what it does in the USA. So it was quite confusing for me. But then this term bleeding heart liberal came up, which I presume is your typical
suicidally empathetic person.
Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. So, but it's taken even to an extreme at this point. So a bleeding heart liberal is kind of stage 1 of suicidal empathy, right? So suicidal empathy is stage 4 pancreatic cancer. It's death, right? Because look, so there's a paper that I wrote a few years ago with one of my former doctoral students, where we looked at how do people allocate their gift-giving expenditures, okay? Yeah. And the idea there was to demonstrate that we have a built-in evolutionary mechanism that mets out our resources in line with an evolutionary calculus. I'm much more likely to give larger gifts to people who share on average half their genes with me, my brothers and sisters, my children, than I am to give to my second cousin, right? And you see this throughout all cultures, all religions, all ethnicities, because we're all biological beings united under a shared biological heritage. Why am I saying all this? Our empathy should also be strategically meted out in a way that makes evolutionary sense, right? It makes more evolutionary sense for me to be willing to sacrifice my life to save my biological children than it is for me to save a random child. The fact that I'm less likely to save a random child doesn't make me a monster or calculus. I would love to save all children, but I'm certainly more likely to jump in front of the fast-moving truck to save my biological children. Right. That's the problem with suicidal empathy, is that system is dysregulated. The El Salvadorian MS-13 gang members, they deserve more empathy coming in here illegally than American vets who lost their limbs fighting for America. That's suicidal empathy.
So this is the expression, going back to the gift giving, charity begins at home.
Exactly.
Is where it comes from too.
Perfect.
And I think in that study you also talked about how women and men are different.
Yes, you want me to talk about that?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. So in that paper, what we wanted to show is what are the reasons that men and women say they are giving gifts to their romantic partners. So the reasons could be either situational or tactical. Situational would be, it's her birthday. It's a situational, okay? Tactical would be, I'm trying to woo her to seduce her, right? Now, not surprisingly, men are much more likely to use the gift-giving ritual for tactical reasons. It's part of the dynamics of men and women. But here's the part that's much more interesting. When you ask men and women, why do you think the other sex gives you gifts? Women are perfectly well calibrated in knowing that the reason that they give gifts to men are different than the reasons why men give them gifts, whereas men are blissfully oblivious to that. So men think, oh, if she gives me a gift, it must be because she's trying to seduce me, because they lack the theory of mind. Now, I'm not saying that men are dumber, but it's because they don't have to have evolved the reading of that courtship ritual. Because if a man is lied to by a woman says, here are flowers, I'll love you forever, let's go behind the shed and have sex. If she lied to him, great. I don't suffer any consequences. If a woman were to be duped by every flower-carrying guy, given that the cost of making a poor mate choice looms much larger for her, right, then she better evolve the capacity to understand those signals.
Professor, what do you think artificial intelligence will do to change, either for good or bad, the parasitic mind or suicidal empathy?
Wow, I've never been asked that exact question. So there you go. Yeah, that's why you're Riz Khan. Look, at this point, I think that the main thing that AI does is it reduces the computational complexity of the search space. You know what I mean? So yeah. So for our listeners and viewers, so take for example chess. If you were to draw out the chess game, the tree of chess, it's I think 10 to the 100 nodes. That's more nodes than there are atoms in the universe, right? So if you were to develop an algorithm to actually exhaustively go through everything, it will be more time than since the sun has existed. Therefore, there are AI algorithms that prune the search tree, that can say, this is not promising, cut this part. And I first learned of this as a mathematics computer science student in the mid-'80s. And I was very excited about AI, But then AI went through a winter storm kind of where it died out, and it's only in the last 5-10 years that it has resurfaced. So I really see things like in medical diagnostics and in things where it can do searches so quickly and in much quicker way than a human could ever. That's where I see. I'm not a fatalist when it comes to AI. The machines are going to take over and eradicate us. I don't know what else to say.
It's not so much that. You know, what's interesting is it still suffers to some degree, AI, from the biases that are programmed into the big data that it draws from.
Like when you ask it for George Washington, it comes out with a black guy.
Oh,
have you seen that?
No.
Oh, you didn't see those?
No.
Gemini, when Gemini first came out, because it had been programmed by super woke people, every single historical figure in the United States came out as a black individual.
That's interesting.
You should go back. And now they've checked it. They've kind of recalibrated it.
Now, I don't know if this was, you know, someone playing around or whether it was real, but there was a time many years ago, if you typed into Google, white men stole my car, it used to ask, did you mean black men stole your car? So there was this idea that, you know, that the garbage in, garbage out situation with AI meant that, you know, up to now, it's going to have its biases. But the reason I ask is, I did an interview recently with Mo Gaudat, who was the former chief business officer of Google X. Okay. Brilliant guy, brilliant AI specialist. I mean, he's quite spectacular, actually, in his thought processes. And he described how, you know, right now, if you just have even 20 IQ points above someone else, it's a massive difference as a human. AI is going to go to the billion level, where it's way beyond. And in that, there's a certain amount of self-awareness, cognizance, and so on. But it can also be something that if we are becoming more and more dependent on AI, we might be able to escape some of the things that you worry about.
That's a great question. Yeah. I mean, so you're saying that AI could be so powerful that it builds a cognitive inoculation against the parasitic ideas.
Exactly, in the sense that it can actually start to, you know, regulate the information that we receive when we do searches to take us out of an echo chamber. It can actually fact check to the point where it's indisputable.
Right. So here's how I can tie what you're saying with something that I've been thinking about. So do you remember the nomological networks that I was telling you about?
Yeah.
As it stands, it takes a great amount of human effort to build that network. And one of the papers that I recently wrote about 3-4 years ago is I wrote a paper, an academic paper, a scientific paper, where I was arguing, imagine if you could now create a Wikipedia of nomological networks. So you ask what is the foundational question that you want to see if you can build a nomological network about, right? Are toy preferences sex specific for evolutionary reasons? Well, it took me, a human being, to say, well, what would be the different distinct lines of evidence that I would have to come up with to prove that there is a universality to these toy preferences? Imagine if that process could be automatized via AI.
And not only that, the access to far wider range of data without having to try to figure out where to go for it, and then the speed with which it would come.
Exactly.
So that's what I'm wondering, whether you see any salvation, you see any inoculation, as you put it, to the parasitic mind.
I mean, as a sort of banal yes or no, I would say yes. But to our earlier point, that AI system is only as good as what I put into it. If what is being put into it is done by parasitized human minds, then who knows?
So Mo, funny enough, just to go back to something he said, he's writing his next book with an AI he has created called Trixie. And he says, if I ask Trixie questions, I get surprising answers. For example, as a Middle Eastern, he's of Egyptian origin, Middle Eastern man, would you, if you were a border officer at, in America, would you grant me access? She said, under current rules, no. So she was quite frank with him.
Wow.
So that's why it's quite we're on an interesting point, I think, a cross point maybe of where AI might actually address with some degree of accuracy and perhaps be a bit of a wake-up call for some of the issues that you seem to have a lot of concern about.
It really is a fantastic question. As you're speaking, I'm thinking about it. I wonder if the AI system might be better at inoculating parasitic thinking rather than parasitic emotional systems, because there is an element that I can codify when it comes to facts and information. it's a lot more how do you parameterize emotions via an AI system?
Well, that apparently is the next step. AI can get to the stage where it's, emotions are firing of neurons. I mean, my background is neurophysiology.
That's true.
So it's kind of ironic. We are literally, in a way, form of.
Are your parents disappointed you didn't become a doctor?
Well, I think my mother kept saying until she saw me on TV, and it was like.
Then it was okay.
She said no. She just said, "Is that a real job?" But I do think listening to people who are experts on this, that it might be an interesting situation. I wonder how that's going to tie in with your work, because everything will be factually far more accurate. The veracity of information will be far more, metrically codified and accurate.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what else to say about it, but I know that my wife recently was interacting with Grok.
Oh, yeah.
Grok 3 or whatever.
X.
The X one. And because we have different options right now we're facing in our personal lives in terms of different universities. Right. In terms of universities that are making me offers. And so she was entering into Grok, what's the best place for us to live? And then she came up to me very excitedly because she said, this Grok is so smart. So,
She said, wait, Montreal.
No. I don't think Grok is ever going to come up with that. If it comes up with that, it must be a scam. Yeah. Montreal is no longer the place for us.
So it's interesting. You're getting a lot of offers. In spite of your willing to jab at academia.
Yeah, well, so can I tell you why? Because I think the zeitgeist is changing.
Okay.
Because the exact same people who were mortified that there was a professor who was talking about such corrosive things such as, oh no, only women can bear children. Yes, freedom of speech is important. Freedom of inquiry is important. Well, those people are now realizing that they really went down the rabbit hole. And not all the universities. Many of universities still think I'm, the ostracized pariah. But a greater number of universities are now coming around, maybe because Donald Trump won, who knows. But so a lot of schools that historically would have shied away from speaking to me are now, there's the Gad love train is in full motion right now.
And you're ready to ride it.
I'm riding it. Go ahead.
You've seen, as someone, who deals with this kind of behavioral psychology of people, the various movements that come up, and you've touched on a couple of them. The Me Too, for example, and Black Lives Matter.
Yeah.
You see more of these kind of things happening along, that we will see more of these kind of movements that I know you see as on the verge of whether it's suicidal empathy or parasitic behavior ideology.
As I said earlier, the capacity for the human mind to be parasitized in endless number of ways is an inherent feature of, the architecture of the human mind. So I can't predict whether there'll be more or less, but it's just, by the way, when I first started my training as a doctoral student, I was studying one type of rationality. And I hope this doesn't get too technical. You'll tell me if it's boring. So are you familiar with the work of Kahneman and Tversky? Do you know? Kahneman and Tversky are two Israeli psychologists, actually. Kahneman won the Nobel Prize in economics for his work that he did in psychology. Tversky didn't win it, his co-author, because he had passed away before they won it, and you can't get it posthumously. Yeah. But what their work was meant to show was that the hyper-rational expectation that economists have of us, that we are these perfect calculational machines. When I'm choosing which car to buy, I look at all of the alternatives, and then I use some utility maximization function to say that it's going to be the Mazda. That's not how people make decisions, right? So for example, here's a violation that they identified. It's called the transitivity axiom. If I prefer car A to car B, and I prefer car B to car C, it must be that I prefer car A to car C. That's called transitivity. If I don't do that, I'm being, quote, irrational. But throughout 40 years of work, they showed that consumers are hardly rational in the way economists expect us. And so it is an indelible feature of the human condition to have these little blind spots, in the same way that you can do experiments in psychophysics where you could show certain visual illusions that people succumb to. We also have these mental spots so I don't expect that moving forward we will be less likely to succumb to this. It's just part of the lacuna of the human spirit.
So one of the interesting things is that we live in a very different era now from even decades ago and centuries ago. So even tying into religion, for example, word spreads so much faster.
That's true.
Everything gets seen so much faster. Judgments get much faster. So in the same way, decision making is sometimes through speed.
Yeah.
And people react. And do you recall that the head of the women's soccer in Spain, Luis Rubiales,
the kiss?
Yeah, kissing. Yeah. And he just got sentenced, or he just got, the adjudication was that he was guilty of doing this. And of course, it gave a lot of power to the Me Too movement in Spain when this happened. Now, there would have been a time where this wouldn't have gone around.
Yeah.
And I wonder how this interconnectivity, the greater interconnectivity we have.
That's a great question. So certainly the fact that we've got these systems that can spread information so quickly makes it more viral, to continue with the metaphor. I mean, does that mean, so are you arguing that by virtue of the fact that the speed at which the stuff can disseminate, does that mean that increases the likelihood of the inoculation or decreases it?
No, I'm saying that, at the moment, it increases the chance of
being parasitic.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, although the antidote also
is communicated.
Is communicated, right? So, I mean, I wouldn't have had, I don't know, 1 million followers on X. I wouldn't have met the people. The people that have been drawn to my work would never have known that I existed, Elon Musk, were it not that there was a central square where my ideas can be, because historically, think about a typical academic. What was my medium of communication? It was the peer-reviewed journal, right? And you want to know how many people read that journal? You know how many people say the average number of academic papers that's cited is 0. Now, there are some papers that are cited 3,000 times, but even an incredibly successful academic paper that's cited 3,000 times, how does that compare with me putting up a post yesterday that was viewed by 10 million people?
That's remarkable.
And so I think, to your point, both the parasitic stuff can increase, but the antidote could also increase.
As we get towards the end of our conversation, a couple of things that occurred to me as someone, especially as you specialized in consumer behavior, but as an evolutionary behavioral scientist, do you believe human behaviors are cyclical? And the reason I ask is, my daughter, who's only a couple of years older than yours, is big on thrifting. And, this very, what do you call it, conspicuous consumption. Is something that she kind of, is sort of to a large degree rejecting. And it's not for a lack of means. It's simply the psychology is now, I want to distance myself from this very visible consumption. And thrifting, I see among her friends as well. It's become kind of trendy. How much do we cycle through these?
That's great. So, of course, historical cycles happen. As a matter of fact, potentially linking it to your daughter's example, do you know that how sexy women's attire is cyclically over the past 100 years correlates with economic conditions within that ecosystem. So it's actually called the hemline index.
Wow.
And this is something that I talk about in The Consuming Instinct, one of my earlier books in 2011, whereby I'm going to see if I remember this correctly. I hope I don't get it wrong. In environments where there is more economic uncertainty, there is a premium on fashion trends and cycles to be sexier. And so yes, I think that the general pattern is that there are cycles. Now, I don't know if your daughter's thriftiness is a manifestation of something inherent to her personality, or I think you're arguing that it is part of a group dynamic.
It seems to be part of a group dynamic, but she appreciates it.
Yeah. So how does that manifest itself? She never wants to dress in brand names. She wants to be frugal.
It's not so much that. It's just saying, hey, I can find great stuff that's been pre-owned, as they would say now.
Okay,
I used to say used, but to use the euphemism pre-owned, and she finds amazing stuff.
Yeah, see that would never work with me, and maybe I'm sharing too much here with your audience. I suffer from huge germ contamination fear.
Right.
So, for example, when I go even to a 5-star hotel, I bring my own sheets.
Okay.
And so the idea of wearing someone else's clothes would not work with this guy's psychology.
Right. So that would. The other thing is that after COVID, after lockdowns where people couldn't go, there was a lot of what I read about, a lot of revenge buying. They called it. like consumers, feeling they'd been deprived for a certain period of time and almost in revenge going out and
they're going to compensate for having been right. I hadn't heard that term, but that makes a lot of sense to me.
Revenge buying. So.
Well, I mean, one of the reasons why I decided that I will use consumer behavior as a place to study human nature is precisely because, short of breathing, consumption is probably the thing that we do most next. I mean, we consume friendships, we consume experiences, we consume religion, we consume literature. So it's not just consumption of Coca-Cola and Starbucks. I mean, we are a consumatory animal. So I thought, what a wonderful place it would be to take my interest in evolutionary psychology and apply it to the modern context of consumer behavior, hence that marriage.
Just as, again, wrapping up now, do you remain optimistic about the way things are going? I mean, you said we're at a certain zeitgeist, but are you really optimistic about things changing for the better on your terms, of course, the parasitic mind, the suicidal empathy? And so on?
I do. I am, in the sense that it would be hard to get out of bed, given the things that I do and deal with, if I didn't think that there's a way to make things better. But on a day-to-day basis, it could be easy to fall trapped to a lot of pessimism, because sometimes when I see the stuff that comes my way, and even though 99.9% of the people are incredibly supportive of what I do, 0.01% of a very big number is still a big number. And so that can, gnaw at you. But overall, I'm someone who has a sunny disposition. And so therefore, I would say I am optimistic.
I raised this, actually, it made me think about how many people I know who are anti-woke culture, but won't say so. So that's why I was curious when you said you have 90-something+% in terms of support. So do you think there are a lot of people out there who want to say something, say anti-woke, for example, and or against the woke culture, but don't dare say it because they could be victimized?
Oh my God, that's the number one reason why the woke stuff was able to proliferate, right? So let me give you, and I've said this before, here is the perfect template of probably the most common email that I've received through all these years. Dear Professor Saad, a bunch of compliments, and then the last sentence is, if you choose to read this letter on your show, please don't mention my name. So then I write back to the person. I say, dear so-and-so, thank you very much for your kind words. I appreciate them. Don't you think the last sentence in your email is precisely why we are in the position we are? And oftentimes that really slaps them in the face, and they'll write back to me and say, but they always argue that they have a uniquely justifiable reason why they shouldn't be the one speaking, right? So if I'm a student, I shouldn't speak because I won't get a good grade. If I'm an assistant professor, I shouldn't speak because I'm going up for tenure. If I am tenured, I shouldn't speak because I'm going for full professor. If I have full professor, I shouldn't speak because I'm applying for a grant. So your career will end, and there's always been a justification for why you shouldn't speak. Speak. Stop being a coward. Don't diffuse the responsibility on a few of us that have to bear all the risks. If we all speak in unison, we'll get rid of the problem by Tuesday.
Well, and academia apart, it's also because there are real world consequences for people in other jobs too, I guess.
Yes, although, and not to seem as though I'm being cavalier about it, whenever someone says that to me, I say the young men who said, I'll go and land on the beaches of Normandy, were they guaranteed safe passage? Or did they know that 80-90% of them were going to be mowed down as though they were insignificant mosquitoes? Yet they did it. So I understand that people have real concerns. And so I'm not asking people to be reckless martyrs, but just say something. It could be you only say it within the confines of your friends at a bar. If they say something insane, challenge them. We just had a conversation about very difficult subjects. We're going to walk away here feeling good. We're going to still be friends, but we had the courage to tackle thorny subjects. Don't be a coward. Speak.
Now you've got this prominence, and with prominence comes the power to change things, which, as you say, hopefully you are. Would you ever go into politics?
Well, two things. Number one, I'm too short for politics. I don't think so, because I'm way too honest, to our earlier point, which is politicians lie. If I fib a millimeter, I will have a bout of conscience that will debilitate me for the rest of my life. I'm worried if I'm going to jaywalk. So you want me to be a politician? I won't last for 4 minutes.
Well, we prefer you out of politics than saying what you say.
Thank you, sir.
Professor, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic. Thank you. Cheers.
Well, Dr. Gad Saad ending our extended conversation there by calling for people to ignore the work culture and to champion truth and freedom of speech, whatever the risks. His next book, Suicidal Empathy, is due out this year, 2025, and expands on his best-selling publication, The Parasitic Mind. That's all for now from me, Riz Khan, and the rest of the team. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to leave your thoughts and comments and subscribe to the channel. We'll see you next time.
At Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Arabiya News,
It's very impressive.
where knowledge meets perspective.
Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive interviews with leading experts every weekday here on Arabiya News. I'm Tom Burges Watson. Coming up on today's programme, a triumphant President Trump delivers a 100-minute-long address to Congress, his first since taking office 6 weeks ago, in which he declares that America is back. Well, in that address, President Trump said he'd received a letter from the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in which he said he was ready to come to the negotiating table. And Palestinians cautiously welcome the outcome of Tuesday's Arab Leaders Summit in Cairo, which endorsed an Egyptian plan to rebuild Gaza without transferring its population. Hello and welcome to the programme. We begin with the latest from President Donald Trump's address to a joint session of the US Congress last night. This was his first such address since he returned to power, and he used the opportunity to declare that, quote, "The American dream is unstoppable." Well, in this, the longest presidential speech to lawmakers on record, he used the 100 minutes to outline his vision for a second term. Well, President Trump said that one of his top priorities was going to be to rescue the economy. And on that note, he pledged to organize the federal government to lower costs. Well, since taking office on the 20th of January, Trump has slashed the federal workforce and cracked down on immigration, whilst imposing tariffs on some of America's biggest trade partners. Well, let's take a listen now to some of the highlights from that address.
America is back. Since taking office, my administration has launched the most sweeping border and immigration crackdown in American history, and we quickly achieved the lowest numbers of illegal border crossers ever recorded. Thank you. To further combat inflation, we will not only be reducing the cost of energy, but will be ending the flagrant waste of taxpayer dollars. Under the Trump administration, all of these scams, and they're far worse, but I didn't think it was appropriate to talk about them. They're so bad. Many more have been found out and exposed and swiftly terminated by a group of very intelligent, mostly young people, headed up by Elon, and we appreciate it. We found hundreds of billions of dollars of fraud.
President Trump speaking there, well, as he delivered that address, the assembled Democrats gave little applause. Some even walked out, and some held up placards saying things like, quote, "This is a lie." Well, in a rebuttal speech, the Democratic Senator Elisa Stolkin urged U.S. citizens to be alert and to stay engaged in U.S. politics.
He's going to make you pay in every part of your life. Grocery and home prices are going up, not down, and he hasn't laid out a credible plan to deal with either of those. His tariffs on allies like Canada will raise prices on energy, lumber, and cars, and start a trade war that will hurt manufacturing and farmers. Your premiums and prescriptions will cost more because the math on his proposals doesn't work without going after your health care.
Okay, well, let's get some more analysis. We can speak now to Mick Mulvaney, former Chief of Staff to President Trump, who joins us from Washington. Mick, great to have you with us once again here on Al Arabiya News. No pressure, you're opening the programme this evening. So let me start by asking you this. If you were to write President Trump's report card for last night, what score would you give him for that 100-minute long speech?
Yeah, Tom, I thought it was a B+ type of speech. First of all, as someone who has to watch the speech for work, I do media here and, of course, overseas with you folks. I had to stay up and watch the whole thing. 2 hours is a really, really long speech. We're hearing some indications this morning that it might be the longest joint address of Congress in history. So that's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but I prefer less is more type of speeches. I thought he did a decent job of handling the heckling early on. I thought he did a good job of addressing the domestic issues. If I had one criticism of the speech, I thought it was short on foreign policy. Foreign policy, by the way, that's not unusual. Ordinarily, American voters don't care that much. American public doesn't follow foreign policy that closely. It's just a virtue of our history and our geography. But that being said, the meeting with Zelensky last week in the Oval Office was so high profile and so garnered so much media attention that I thought we might get a little bit more detail last night on foreign policy in general and Ukraine in specific. But the reports here are pretty good. The polling is in the overnights, and the approval ratings of the speech across all political spectrums are in the high 60s, low 70s. That's pretty good for any politician in this divided environment in my country.
Okay, so just to recap, you would take off a couple of points because it was too long, and you thought it was a little on the light side with regards to foreign policy, hence the B grade. 6 weeks, I mean, so much has happened. I mean, there's been this whirlwind of activity, sometimes very hard to keep track of it. Do you think perhaps the president's trying to do too much too quickly?
No, I think it's by design. There's a term in sports called flooding the zone, where you just put as many players up towards the goal as you can at one time, and that's what they're doing. Keep in mind, he's in a unique situation in our history of having come back to the White House after spending 4 years away. So his team has had 4 years to think and plan and plot as to what they wanted to do. So what you're seeing is the rush of material that they've been working 4 years on. So no, I don't think they're doing too much. I think they're doing it on purpose, and I think they're going to be able to keep this pace up at least until the summer, and maybe even as far as the entire calendar year.
Let's just talk about the Democrats. I don't know if you watched the rebuttal speech, which presumably came afterwards. In that speech, the Senator Stoltkin referenced Ronald Reagan and his efforts during the Cold War. I think she said words to the effect she would have rather had President Reagan around during those days than she would have liked to have President Trump had he been on the political scene in those days. I mean, what was she getting at, do you think?
Yeah, look, I know Elise. I like Elise, a very talented, very, very bright lady. And it was a decent speech. Keep in mind, no one's talking about the speech, which means she did a good job. Ordinarily, that is the graveyard of American politicians, that people seem to fail in that response position. There's a long list of politicians whose careers have ended because of that speech, and she didn't fall into that. She did a nice job and gave a basically unremarkable speech. I would give her the same advice about Ronald Reagan as I gave to Mike Pence, who's a good friend of mine, who, when he ran for president this past cycle, would talk about Ronald Reagan all the time. I'm 57 years old. And I was too young to vote for Ronald Reagan. Talking about Ronald Reagan today is like talking about Herbert Hoover in the 1920s. No one knows who he is anymore. So I think it's intellectually very interesting. I think the media pays attention. Folks like me who do this for a living pay attention. But I'm not sure those types of messages land with the folks that you're trying to speak to.
Quite interesting to watch the audience there. I mean, at various points, Republicans got up and, gave their approval, their thumbs up to what the president was saying. The Democrats remained seated and hardly clapped at all. Very interesting to see, though, Republicans not standing up in large numbers when the president talked about tariffs. And I'm just wondering if you think that's an indication that perhaps people are a little bit uncomfortable within the party about this particular policy.
Yeah, I think you're spot on that analysis. I think there's a lot of folks who are nervous about tariffs. Why? Look, what Trump is doing writ large, they're hoping will have a downward pressure on prices, but tariffs taken by themselves are an upward pressure on prices. And politicians of both parties are hearing from voters right now about how expensive things are. And even though tariffs may only increase prices in the short term, before other Trump policies can kick in to lower prices, they're going to raise prices in the short term. And that's a problem politically. Keep in mind, Donald Trump doesn't have to run for office again. In fact, Donald Trump cannot run for office again. And we won't have another presidential election here until 2028. But everybody sitting on that floor in the House of Representatives last night has to run again in about 18 months, which means that election starts in about 12 months, if not less than that. So, yeah, there's a lot of people who want to run for re-election who would love to see prices go down, and tariffs are not going to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think on the economic score, there are some complicated questions, some difficult to balance equations. I mean, consumer sentiment surveys showing that people are worried about inflation worsening. You've touched on inflation. These job cuts, we're obviously going to see the unemployment rate, certainly in the DC area and probably in other parts of the country as well, going up. Demand is going to come down for US products with reciprocal tariffs. And then the president wants to balance the federal budget and at the same time enact sweeping tax cuts. I mean, something here doesn't completely add up, does it?
Oh, no, but it never does in politics. I mean, you show me a politician who knows how to count. I mean, that is the rare thing. And voters don't really count that much. That's how you get $36 trillion in debt. No, look, they're not going to balance the budget, period, end of story. It's never, ever going to happen. I was the budget director for Donald Trump in the first term. The budget I wrote in 2017, which is now 8 years ago, was the last one that showed any pathway towards real balancing. It's not going to happen. So, yeah, there's a lot of crosstalk. There's a lot of things that are not reconcilable, which is why, again, go back to your original point. So many of those politicians were sort of slow to cheer tariffs because that's real. Talk of balancing budgets and so forth, that's sort of pie in the sky. Talk about what the price of eggs is, and Trump did mention that last night. That's absolutely real. I don't worry too much about the job cuts in the government sort of impacting the unemployment rate. I think if they could fire 20,000 people, that's going to be a lot. In a good month in this country, we create about 200,000 new jobs. So that's a small number. That's not going to affect the macroeconomic sort of arc of the country. But the tariffs are real. We import $3.8 trillion worth of goods here every single year. And a 10% tariff is a $380 billion price increase for the American consumer. And that's a real number.
Sure. Well, we'll be talking more about the economy later in the year when, of course, the national debt ceiling has to be raised once again. Otherwise, there'll be a catastrophic default. But let's move on to foreign policy, that little touched on area of the speech that you identified right at the beginning. I mean, world leaders, the whole world would have been watching very closely, listening very closely. Overall, what is the message you think this new administration is sending out to the rest of the world?
I think it's very similar to what it was in the first term. I thought one of the best lines that Donald Trump used in the first term was "America first doesn't mean America alone." Yes, he is looking to reset the relationships with a bunch of different countries and regions. I think it's fair to say he's skeptical about the long-term prospects of our relationship with Europe, that he sees Europe moving in a different direction than he sees America moving. By the way, I put the UK in sort of a middle ground between those two things. The ties between those two countries are so strong that I don't consider, of course, they're not part of Europe, I guess technically anymore, geographically they are, but that you're seeing him review sort of the relationships that we have. Doesn't mean we're going to drop out of NATO. It just means that he's going to look differently at Russia, differently at China, differently at India, differently at our alliances in Asia. I think he thinks now that Australia and Japan are better and more reliable allies right now than, say, France and Germany are. So that is real. It doesn't mean you're going isolationist, and I know that gets pitched that way often overseas, but it means that the relationships will be different. He wants to be much closer to countries in the GCC, I think, than previous administrations do. So it's a different sort of world. It's not a Cold War aligned world anymore, and that is, I wish he had put some more flesh on that bone last night.
Just as we wrap up, Mick, let's look back at these last 6 weeks of the second Trump administration. What stands out for you? What would you say are the most memorable moments? And do you think there's one in there that's a memory for the history books, or is it too soon?
Well, I mean, if you had to, I mean, it's so hard to look back 6 weeks when so much happened so quickly, right? I think right now, everybody sort of looks at that Oval Office meeting last Friday with Vladimir Zelensky. That will have a place in the history books. But personally, for me, I see this attempt to reform the federal government and reform the power of the executive. Keep in mind, under our system of separation of powers, you have the legislature, you have the executive, you have the judiciary, and there's always a tension between those three. It has been from the very beginning. Donald Trump is talking about not spending money that Congress tells him to spend. The first president who made that argument was Thomas Jefferson in 1800. So this tension is real. But every 100 years or so, it looks like maybe we have a reset on the balance of power between the branches. FDR really was the one who sort of established the social welfare state in this country, and the government as the implementer of that. And is Donald Trump trying to reset that? I know that's sort of esoteric. I know that's very sort of 30,000 feet, but I see that as the general trend of this administration. And I think that's the most interesting thing in the macro that we've seen in the first 6 weeks, although it's hard to when you look at the micro level day by day, the Zelensky meeting last Friday will be one they talk about for a long time.
I think they probably will. Thank you very much indeed. Always a pleasure talking to you, Mick Mulvaney. Thanks again.
Thanks, Tom.
Well, for more analysis, we can speak now to Sam Nunberg, former advisor to President Trump, who joins us now from Washington as well. Sam, great to have you with us as well. 6 weeks in, the president declaring America is back. Is it a little early to be saying that, do you think?
Well, substantively it is, and also he has to do that obviously for political reasons. That speech was masterful last night. When you look at the reviews, I have to tell you personally that when I heard that the speech in advance was going to be over 2 hours or around 2 hours, I rolled my eyes. That famously, for your audience to understand, Bill Clinton gave a State of the Union speech, which was panned as one of the worst speeches ever because he went too long. Now, when we talk about America's success, what he has done, and he has been able to do through executive orders and obviously through the power of his presidency and personality, is undo immediately failures of Biden, particularly when you look at border enforcement. Illegal immigrants crossings have dramatically dropped to the point that they're the lowest even during his presidency. When you look at what he's been able to do in terms of taking away the red tape, the bureaucracy of government, he has the power through executive orders, and he's been able to cut regulations, particularly on the energy industry. And then going into the culture, and culture is policy, culture is politics now in the United States. He's been able to undo DEI policies across the federal government. And he's also been able to, as I believe it is, respect women in sports by making sure that that males are not able to compete in women's sports. When you look at last night, though, one thing that I was shocked about is normally when any president speaks, you can even look at Biden's State of the Unions and address to Congress, you will have Republicans clapping on certain issues. What I saw last night, I have never seen in terms of the Democrats, particularly a congressman from Texas having to be escorted out. I'm 43 years old. I've been watching these speeches since I'm 5. That has never happened during my lifetime. And you saw that they were really having an open debate and or being raucous against him. What I would say, though, too, is his presidency, and this is one thing that I said in my last interview, I can't believe the way it's able to move so quickly and dramatically. When you look at his showdown with Zelensky in the Oval Office last Friday, and substantively before his address to Congress, Zelensky issues a statement. It looks like the mineral deal with the United States will be closing. When you look at what he's been able to do in the Middle East, in terms of he has really put the screws back on Iran while looking at a diplomatic track with Russia And vis-a-vis Hamas in Israel, obviously we don't know what the developments will be there in terms of Israel re-engaging a kinetic activity within Gaza. But we have seen that dramatic, I think, improvements, and you don't have to believe me, the American people voted for this, have been happening.
All right, Sam, I mean, you raised lots of points there. I mean, we were just speaking to Mick Mulvaney, a former chief of staff to President Trump, before we crossed to you, asked him for a scorecard. He gave President Trump a B+, I think, said it was a bit on the long side and a little light on foreign policy. Do you concur, or would you be a bit more generous?
Well, I'm a speechwriter, and I work in politics. And before I give you my grade, which is an A-, you have to see that he had personal, he had policy, he had political, and then he ended it with a theme. And that was quite clear. Plus, you know, this goes into Donald Trump's personality and the way he's able to present. And the fact that he was going back and forth with the Democrats was something that was unique, that hasn't been seen, and certainly wasn't seen in the previous 4 addresses to Congress under Joe Biden. So I thought that this was one of the best speeches I've seen. His speech writers are excellent. You could tell from the draft that he received what he then put input. And also, when you look at the presentation in terms of picking out particular instances across America, I mean, he admitted a cadet into West Point whose father was murdered. You obviously had that a boy who's unfortunately suffering from cancer, that he had the Secret Service make him an honorary member, and then he held almost a live vigil for a victim, a woman who was murdered by an illegal immigrant. Now, in terms of foreign policy, I'll disagree with Mick Mulvaney. The number one issue within the United States right now is obviously Russia and Ukraine, coming to some kind of resolution in this and U.S. involvement. And he's obviously reversing course from Biden. And that's really the top policy point that's in the American psyche. I would also say you have to look at all public polling. I have not seen anything private, but you have to look at all public polling. And I can assure you that CNN, for instance, wasn't happy putting up that 75% of Americans agreed with policy points that he brought up, and also approved of the speech.
Yeah, one of the polls that I saw, which is not directly related to the speech, but you'll see the connection. It's a Reuters Ipsos poll, and it said that 70% of Americans, and 2/3 of them Republican, say that Russia is more to blame for the Ukraine war than Ukraine is. After all, Ukraine was invaded. It didn't invade itself.
They were.
Do you think perhaps, there is a feeling, therefore, that President Trump, and you say that it looks like, and I think President Trump himself said it looks like the minerals deal will now go ahead. Fences have been mended. But do you think he has to perhaps go a little easy on Ukraine? Because he's been pretty tough on President Zelensky.
I do. In our last interview, you asked me why is he saying stronger comments against Zelensky, and I explained that he's trying to show that he holds the cards here and that he can get a deal on the table for the Russians and negotiate with them. The one thing I would say, though, too, is for Americans, I think Vladimir Putin is the least popular, most hated foreign adversary of the United States right now. And the key is for the Trump administration and President Trump to be able to explain that he's not going to be in the business of criticizing Vladimir Putin, which, by the way, he's never done. But Marco Rubio, for instance, the Secretary of State, has called him a thug and a gangster, that he can't do that right now while he's trying to negotiate and mediate. But yes, that is an issue. That is a thorny issue that you bring up, where there really is a fine line politically for him to do. He cannot be seen as being pro-Putin. He cannot be seen as being pro-Putin. So he should be saying more publicly, that we're negotiating from a point of strength, but he will verify. He will, trust but verify, and things along those lines. But yes, I would agree with you that this could be a problem for him. It could be problematic going forward.
All right, Sam, just lastly, and we'll have to be quite brief.
Sir.
One of the descriptions I've been given of the Trump administration, I'd like to get your thoughts on this, is that President Trump and his team are a team of disruptors. This is what the country needs, a full audit and some spring cleaning, perhaps a deep clean. Is that roughly how you see things?
Look, disruption, that's a term that's used in finance. That's a term particularly used in tech finance, obviously. It's the term being used with AI. What I would say is that what they have to be able to continue to communicate to the American people is that this is about waste, fraud, and abuse, and point out examples within that. And I do think that DOGE itself, I support it, but we need to be they should be a little more careful in terms of when they're presenting certain findings, that they have to make sure that they are completely accurate. But I would tell you that, for instance, the American people do support cutting USAID and reforming it.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Great speaking to you once again, Sam Nunberg.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it. Well, in that address to Congress, President Trump said he had received a letter from the Ukrainian President, Volodymyr Zelensky, saying that he is ready to begin peace negotiations as soon as possible. Well, President Trump read aloud from that letter, which was along similar lines to a message that President Zelensky had posted on X earlier on in the day. Well, President Trump signaled that Russia is also ready for dialogue.
I received an important letter from President Zelensky of Ukraine. The letter reads, Ukraine is ready to come to the negotiating table as soon as possible to bring lasting peace closer. Nobody wants peace more than the Ukrainians, he said. My team and I stand ready to work under President Trump's strong leadership to get a peace that lasts. We do really value how much America has done to help Ukraine maintain its sovereignty and independence. Regarding the agreement on minerals and security, Ukraine is ready to sign it at any time that is convenient for you. I appreciate that he sent this letter, just got it a little while ago.
Well, let's get some more analysis. We can speak now to Greg Swenson, chair of the Republicans Overseas, who joins us from the United Kingdom. Thank you very much indeed for joining us once again, Greg. We're just hearing an excerpt from that letter sent by President Zelensky saying that Ukraine's ready to come to the negotiating table as soon as possible to bring lasting peace closer, it read. Does that mean the damage and the bad blood between President Zelensky and Trump is water under the bridge?
Tom, that's a good way to put it. I think it really is. And, there were some mistakes made on Friday. I think it was, missteps by President Zelensky and surely a missed opportunity. But 3 days later, he came back to the table, which is a good sign. I think that's I think it's good for both Ukraine and for the U.S.
Yeah, I mean, the Ukrainian president said it was, quote, regrettable what happened in the Oval Office. Does that sound to you like an apology or a sort of a veiled apology?
No, I think it's an apology, and it doesn't really matter too much, what the specific language is. It's more, what's the outcome here, and that's what's most important to President Trump, and I think that's what's most important to the people in Ukraine. And so, yeah, Friday could have been a real failure long term if he didn't come back to the table, or if for some reason they weren't able to get over the hump. But it looks like they both have.
Yeah, I mean, if we have time, we'll talk a bit more about what happened on Friday and
Sure.
sort of who's to blame. But let's sort of look forwards and see what happens next. I mean, Ukraine saying it's ready to sign that minerals deal. I mean, is your understanding that the deal does provide security guarantees for Ukraine?
I think it implies that, Tom. I don't think they're going to put it in writing, and I think that was a bit of the dispute on Friday when Zelensky tried to sort of renegotiate or relitigate the agreement in front of the media, and I think that would be a mistake. But I do think that there's implications in there. I mean, this gives the U.S. a real stake in Ukraine. And it's a partnership, too. It's not like the U.S. is going in and stealing all their resources. It's a 50-50 partnership. You'll have significant capital, American capital, coming into Ukraine. And also, the output ultimately, which will take a long time because it's minerals. But the output will be a 50-50 joint venture to reinvest into Ukraine. So I think it's a win-win for both countries.
In terms of military aid to Ukraine, obviously it was cut off on Monday. Now that the fences appear to have been mended to a certain extent, I mean, can we expect that aid to resume?
Yeah, I think so, Tom. And in the ultimate conclusion or the ultimate outcome would be that we won't need to be providing aid, military aid, if there is peace, if there is a ceasefire and it's a sustainable one. And so, but yeah, I don't imagine the president wants to really cut off completely. You know, it was a pause. It was not a permanent withdrawal. And I do think that, you know, it takes a while for any of that to sort of, you know, settle in. And, you know, in fact, the Ukrainians could continue fighting as they have been for months before any sort of pause in military support would take effect. But I don't think, I would hope anyway, that that's not necessary.
Do you think it was right to pause aid on Monday? I mean, isn't that going a bit far? Or do you think the desired effect was, you know, shot across the bows and get President Zelensky to fall back into line?
Yeah, I think it was the latter, Tom. And look, the president's all about outcomes. How he gets there is always different than presidents past, both Republican and Democrat. I think he's got a different way of doing things. He likes to throw a grenade in the room once in a while. He's provocative, but that's refreshing. That's one of the reasons he won the election in November. And he doesn't really do things the way that traditional politicians behave. And so, look, I think however he does it, he's all about the outcome. And so it worked, you know, and it actually worked faster than many of us expected. And, you know, not quite as fast as the president of Colombia changing his mind in 30 minutes. But still, I mean, 72 hours and perhaps Monday and that pausing in aid, maybe that inspired Zelensky to write that letter or to come around. But, you know, either way, the outcome is what's important.
It is, and you know, I was going to ask you whether, you know, this Trump approach had served as a useful catalyst to diplomacy, and you've answered that question. But in the process, quite a number of America's trusted allies have really been given a case of the jitters. Well, we're going to hear from the French president this evening, for example. Europeans holding summits of their own, wondering what the state of their alliance and the state of relations is with Washington. I mean, is this really the best way to go about things?
Look, again, the method doesn't really matter. I think it's the outcomes. And if you look at the way President Trump has been speaking to the Europeans for 8 years now, he's always been really transparent and delivering. Sometimes it's news or comments that are a little uncomfortable, you know, telling the Germans that they're way too dependent on Russian oil and gas. Well, he turned out to be quite right about that. And we saw the crisis that they went through in 2022, and they started burning coal again. They started building nuclear plants again. You know, Trump was right about that. It's uncomfortable, but I think it's important that it's done. And I think the fact that the Europeans might finally get together and start providing for their own defense and security is a really good thing. It's good not only for America because it's more fair and balanced in terms of what we provide versus what they provide, but it's also better for the Europeans. So again, some feelings might be hurt along the way, but you saw Macron in the Oval Office last Monday. You saw the Prime Minister here in the UK, Keir Starmer, in the Oval Office on Thursday. Those were really great diplomatic moments. The president can be diplomatic in the old-fashioned way, and I think he was. But there's times where he'll be disruptive, and he's disruptive. His disruptiveness is what actually creates the outcomes. I think this could be a great outcome if the Europeans actually deliver on defense and security commitments.
Sure. I mean, I think everyone wants, you know, peace in Ukraine. I mean, there are very few people who'll say it would be a great thing if the war carried on. But I think what a lot of people in Europe are worried about is that if the wrong deal is struck, because it's struck in haste, I mean, anyone will tell you who's negotiated a deal. I mean, you don't do important deals in a hurry with, you know, and we're only 44 days into this new Trump administration. I mean, isn't there a sense that perhaps, you know, one thing at a time, and on this particular issue, perhaps, you know, more haste, less speed?
Yeah, no, it's a great point, Tom. And look, nobody knows what the outcome is going to be here. You know, we don't know the details of any sort of peace agreement or ceasefire. But what's important is there is urgency, right? Because every day soldiers are dying and civilians are dying. So I think there's some real urgency there. I'm not suggesting that it will be perfect. I hope it happens quickly, but I hope it happens effectively as well. So it's a great point, and this is a new way of doing business in many ways. The way that this administration has come in, you know, guns blazing or hit the ground running on January 21st. It's been an incredible 2 months. So if some things happen too quickly, and you know there's some scar tissue or some collateral damage along the way, unfortunately, that's a risk. But I think, you know, the break things and be different, you know, attitude, or break things and move quickly, you know, that's working so far. And that's why his approval ratings are amazing, specifically on the things that he's doing so far.
Sure. We're hearing from the US-based Institute for the Study of War saying that Russia's advance has slowed slightly in February. That's probably significant, isn't it, as far as the negotiations are concerned, because it will give Kyiv, presumably, just a little bit more bargaining power.
Yeah, look, you always, you know, obviously in any negotiation, you want to have the strength. You want to be in the more powerful position. So yeah, some good outcomes from Ukraine would be great, but I don't think that's a reason to wait too long. I mean, in a perfect world, yes, there'd be some Ukrainian gains, and there'd be a sense of power over Putin in the negotiations. But who knows? I couldn't tell you what, you know, to expect next week or the week after in terms of battlefield gains or losses. And why would we want to risk, you know, the lives of Ukrainian soldiers in the meantime? So I think there's got to be some effort. You know, I'm glad that the Russian advance has slowed down. All the more reason to stop this before they're able to get better organized and make bigger gains.
Sure. And in terms of, you know, the diplomacy between the Russians and the Ukrainians, I mean, it's not being ruled out that we'll see a Zelensky-Putin face-to-face meet. That's I'd like to get your thoughts on that. One of the noises we heard out of Moscow today, the former president Dmitry Medvedev saying that Russia's main task, quote, remains to inflict maximum defeat on Ukraine. I mean, that doesn't sound too conciliatory, does it?
No, it doesn't. And I think there's reasons why there are times where you really don't want the two leaders to be in the same room. I'm not suggesting that this is one of them, but it's always a risk. And, you know, at the end of the Korean War, the South Koreans were not involved in that negotiation at all. You know, the leader of a country that's going to make concessions that will make him unpopular, especially with certain segments of their society, you know, that's going to be difficult. So I wouldn't suggest that, you know, the face-to-face meeting is absolutely mandatory. It might be better to have sort of negotiations done by a third party, but we'll see. And I think, again, the urgency here is to stop the killing.
And just to wrap up, you know, looking back at these 7 days of, you know, major events with regards to the diplomacy surrounding this war, do you think Friday will go down in history as having been a significant event, or do you think it's just a blip in an otherwise more important, larger relationship?
Yeah, I think, you know, if you'd asked me Saturday, Tom, I would have said it was a significant moment and it was, you know, a complete debacle. But I think, you know, in the days following, we've learned a few things. One is that, you know, as you heard from the president last night, Zelensky came around and things are much more calm. He expressed regret about what happened. The other thing that we've learned is Friday morning, the Democrats hosted a breakfast at the Hay Adams Hotel, right across the street from the White House, just before President Zelensky went to see President Trump. And they really tried to talk him into rejecting the deal, rejecting the minerals deal, and being a little bit more, you know, negative with President Trump. And that really, it looks like that really had an effect on him. So that was a big mistake. So in retrospect, we can't really blame everything on President Zelensky. I think, you know, Senator Chris Murphy, the Democrat from Connecticut, you know, has a lot to answer for, given that he was bragging about On Twitter, he was literally bragging about convincing Zelensky to reject the deal, and look what happened. So I'm glad it's settled. I think now that we've got a much more cooperative arrangement between President Zelensky and President Trump, kissed and made up, basically. I think it's a good thing. So Friday will be a bit more of a blip than anything else.
I said that was the last question. It wasn't, in fact. I've been given one more question to ask you. That was my last question about Ukraine. I wanted to ask you about last night's address to Congress by President Trump. 100 minutes of it. We were talking about it earlier with some other guests. Just want to get your reaction to the fact that the Democrats, some of them got up, walked out. Not much clapping either from the Democrats there in the House of Representatives. What's your reaction to that?
Yeah, I'm not surprised. The Democrats have hit an all-time low in the polling. They're polling in the low 30s. I don't think they can get much worse, although they tried their best last night. It's really sad to see. And I don't think that sort of rejection will work. 76% of the viewers approved of President Trump's speech, only 23 disapproved. And it was a roughly 50-50 audience, 51% Republican, 27% independent, and 20% Democrat. So, the Republicans were only half the audience, and yet it got 76% approval. 68% of the viewers said it was hopeful. 74% said he looked presidential. The Democrats are looking really pathetic right now, and I don't think that strategy is going to work. It surely hasn't so far.
Okay, well, this really is the end. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Greg Swedson, always a pleasure talking to you.
Thanks a lot, Tom. Good to see you.
Now, what does the future hold for Gaza? Well, the US President Donald Trump has proposed one plan, whilst Arab nations have another. Well, President Trump is proposing that the US take control of Gaza and transform it into what he described as the Riviera of the Middle East. But regional leaders gathered in Cairo, Egypt, have reservations because Trump's plan entails the expulsion of 2.3 million people from the Gaza Strip, a move that's been met by fierce opposition from Arab leaders, including Saudi Arabia's foreign minister, Prince Faisal bin Farhan.
We in the kingdom categorically reject any infringement of the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people, whether through settlement policies, annexation of Palestinian lands, or attempts to dispel Palestinians from their lands. We also stress the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination on their land and to establish their independent state on the 1967 borders, with East Jerusalem as its capital.
Well, at that summit in Cairo, Arab leaders endorsed Egypt's reconstruction plan for Gaza, which would cost $53 billion. And importantly, it avoids displacing any Palestinians from the enclave. Well, that stands in stark contrast, as we've been saying, to President Trump's vision of turning Gaza into a Middle Eastern Riviera. However, the White House has dismissed the Arab proposal, saying it doesn't address the realities on the ground in Gaza, and it reaffirmed President Trump's commitment to his own plan. Well, other key questions about Gaza's future include who will govern the enclave. Well, under the Egyptian plan, a committee consisting of independent Palestinian technocrats and non-partisan figures would be formed under the Palestinian Authority to manage the territory for a transitional period of 6 months. Let's listen in now to what the Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi had to say.
Egypt, in cooperation with its brothers in Palestine, worked to form an administrative committee of independent Palestinian professionals and technocrats, entrusted with managing the Gaza Strip based on the expertise of its members. This committee would be responsible for overseeing the relief process and managing the affairs of the Gaza Strip for an interim period, in preparation for the return of the Palestinian Authority to the Gaza Strip.
Well, for more analysis, we can cross to Cairo now and speak to Ambassador Hasham Youssef, who is a former Egyptian diplomat and former spokesperson and chief of staff to the Arab League, Secretary General Amr Moussa. Thank you so much for joining us once again here on Al Arabiya News. Let me just ask you, first of all, about this Egyptian reconstruction plan for Gaza. Lots of pages, 112 pages of that plan. It was unveiled on Tuesday, and it means that no Palestinians will be displaced from the enclave. Tell us, can this plan work?
Well, Egypt has been involved in aspects pertaining to the reconstruction of Gaza for several decades. And in the last years, there were a number of wars, and Egypt contributed and participated in reconstruction. Of course, we're talking about a totally different magnitude, but it is not, rocket science. Issues of reconstruction have been dealt with around the world since World War II and before. And what the Arab side, led by Egypt in relation to the plan, have concluded that this is a plan that can be adopted. And it was not done only by Egypt. It was done by Egypt in cooperation with the Palestinians, as well as the UNDP, the World Bank, and other Arab countries. So, and it takes into consideration all kinds of aspects pertaining to the experience in UNDP and the World Bank and Egypt and other countries that wanted to contribute to this process. And it will be discussed with others, donors, international community, and so on. And we hope that this would work. This is the whole objective.
Okay, and the $53 billion price tag, I mean, where is that money going to come from specifically?
Well, this is a problem, because it is not only related to money, because the vast majority of donors have indicated without any shred of doubt that they will not be willing to pay for reconstruction or early recovery, and that all their money would be destroyed in a few years. So this is a requirement by donors, and they are justified because they have seen their money being destroyed time and again in Gaza. So now the question is, will the international community be able to put the Israeli-Palestinian conflict on a track to a resolution in order for countries to be forthcoming? Because as you well know, that the situation in Gaza and the situation in as far as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is concerned is a major issue, not only regionally, but also globally. And the world is ready to help, but they have requirements, and they are justified in the requirements that they have.
Yeah, I mean, the White House has said that Washington does not approve this plan. They say it doesn't address Gaza's reality. And they're standing by President Trump's Middle East Riviera vision for Gaza. I mean, which one of these very different propositions do you see as being more likely to materialize?
Well, I think the whole world had difficulties with the idea of mass expulsion from Gaza. And there hasn't been any explanation as to why this is necessary. Yes, the situation is devastating. Yes, Gaza is like a demolition area and so on. But this doesn't mean that the Palestinians cannot rebuild their own land. So the question is, where did this happen before, that you had to depopulate an area in order to achieve reconstruction? And then the United States is arguing that, well, the situation in Gaza is inhumane and we need to move the Palestinians. So is the West Bank humane with what's happening in the West Bank? So the situation, in as far as a situation is inhumane, it is inhumane in Gaza, it is inhumane in the West Bank, and the solution is to try to advance peace rather than think of ideas as if this is a real estate deal that needs to be implemented without answering all kinds of questions in relation to who will do the reconstruction if you ask all the Palestinians to leave. What would be the legal status of the area? Who will decide on the plans? There are hundreds of questions as to what this would entail. But people are objecting to the principle because they think that this is something that contradicts international law, and therefore are not willing to discuss even the details, because as far as the vast majority of countries in the world are concerned, this is something that is in violation of international law, and they're not willing to entertain the idea. So I haven't seen any support coming from any country publicly saying we think that this is a good idea, other than the support that it is getting from Israel.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for your time. We're going to have to leave it there. Ambassador Hesham Youssef, thank you very much again.
Thank you.
Well, that is all we have time for on Global News today. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, bye-bye.
From the White House to Gaza, Kiev to Beijing, elections, economics and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deepfake and artificial intelligence,
They've got to have a vote and a say.
it's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers,
My campaign is going very well.
presidents, prime ministers, princes and peacemakers, and cultural tastemakers.
As Arabs, as Middle Eastern, we're too emotional.
Join me on the Riz Khan Show for empowering conversation.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome, of course, to the Saudi House. Today, we're going to be talking about climate change, Saudi Arabia in particular, their contributions to addressing global environmental challenges. His Excellency Adel Al-Jubeir is here with me. Your Excellency, it's wonderful to see you as always.
It was a pleasure.
I want to kick off, though, by asking you about what we've seen in just the last 48 hours. U.S. President Donald Trump signing a raft of executive agreements and pledging to withdraw from the Paris Accords. In your mind, does that damage the world's ability to fight climate change?
I don't believe so. I think there are different ways of achieving the objective that we all want, and countries can pursue whatever path they believe is best for them. I think the important thing is the bottom line. The Trump administration in the first term actually did a lot to reduce carbon in the United States. So this is a very positive development. I think the important thing is that we look at these discussions as cooperative discussions, not as negotiations, because we're all trying to find the most optimum path forward to dealing with the challenges in a way that's unemotional, that's logical, that's scientific, so that we can overcome this challenge that we have. We're all in this together. There are no winners or losers. We all win or we all lose. That's the attitude that we in Saudi Arabia bring to this discussion.
Just 2 years ago here at the World Economic Forum, Al Gore described what was happening in climate as boiling oceans and rain bombs. A lot of people pushed back on that at the time privately, but they didn't necessarily feel comfortable doing so on a public stage. In your mind, how are these words changing when we describe climate?
We have a challenge that is before us with regard to climate change and with global warming. Nobody can dispute that, and the impact that it has on not only our climate, but on our politics, on conflicts, on not in dispute. I think what we need to adopt is a rational, scientifically based conversation, not grandstanding and not threatening, because it will be like the shepherds who cried wolf too many times and then nobody believed them. We know we have a problem. We know we have a challenge. So now that we know this, let's not talk about how it's going to kill all of us. Let's talk about how we extricate ourselves from this problem. We can do it by education. We can do it by more rational policies. We can do it by more efficient production of energy. We can do it by more efficient use of energy. We can do it by investing in alternative sources of energy. We can use it by combating desertification, by land restoration. We can use it by funding research to experiment with transformative technologies. And we are in Saudi Arabia doing all of this. We are setting aside 30% of our territory, land as well as sea, to be protected areas so that they're untouched. We are investing in greening. We are investing in transforming waste into energy. We are investing in solar, in hydro, we're looking seriously at nuclear power. We're investing in capturing carbon from the atmosphere. We're investing in a blue economy. We're investing in our seas and sustainable fishing. We are doing all of it because of two reasons. One, we live on this planet. We breathe the same air everybody does, and it's important for us that it's a healthy planet. And two, it's also very profitable. So there's an economic incentive to do this. And we have taken our experience and we expanded it into initiatives like the Middle East Green Initiative, which includes more than 22 countries, to teach countries how to incorporate the circular carbon economy approach so they can deal with environment and climate change issues the way we have been, so that we all benefit in our region. Because, as I said, we all win or we all lose. We are all in this together, and climate and pollution doesn't differentiate between one country and another. That's why the effort has to be regional and it has to be global.
Would you say then perhaps that the election of Donald Trump and his presidency is the great reset that the climate conversation needed?
I hope it would be, because I think everybody is concerned about environment and everybody is concerned about climate, and it's important that all of us, individuals and nations and companies, do everything we can to deal with this challenge. But we will deal with this challenge. We have the technology, we have the financial resources. We need the political will to engage in a positive, cooperative conversation where we all come up with the best way forward, rather than engage in an emotional, argumentative, political scoring, hypocritical conflict that serves nobody.
Speaking of hypocrisy, over the last several days in the Financial Times, there's been reporting that billions of dollars have fled out of green ETFs and green investing. In your mind, are they jumping the gun there?
I don't know why they pulled out and what investment criteria they have. I do know that in Saudi Arabia, the investments that we have made in renewable energy, in solar, in turning waste into energy, when we're looking at nuclear, when we're looking at efficiencies, ensuring that we don't have flaring of oil and gas, that we don't have leakages, that those have been extremely profitable. We have huge investments in electric vehicles. We're looking at producing electric batteries. We're looking at storage facilities. And for us, these have been very profitable investments. So we are committed to continuing to invest in this. But in terms of the withdrawal of funds, I don't know what was the reason for them investing in those funds in the first place. I don't know what the returns are, so I'm not in a position to comment on it. But what I can say is it could be a function of people getting excited, wanting to do politically the right thing, and then realizing maybe the funds should have gone somewhere else.
When you think about what Saudi Arabia is doing in this fight against climate change and to make the planet, frankly, a better place, it was interesting. His Royal Highness Prince Abdulaziz just a few days ago during the Future Minerals Forum in Saudi Arabia talked about exporting enriched uranium, yellow cake. That's politically dicey, if you will, as you know. In your mind, how do you explain those kinds of exports to the world?
Very simple. We are a large energy producer in the world. We want to be an exporter of energy to the world, whether that energy is oil or gas, whether that energy is solar, whether that energy is electricity, whether that energy is hydro, whether that energy is nuclear. We want to have a nuclear program in Saudi Arabia to produce energy. We have between 1% and 4%, according to estimates, of the world's uranium deposits in country. It makes a lot of sense to exploit those resources economically by mining it. It makes even more sense that once you mine it, that you engage in the processing to turn the uranium into fuel that you can sell at a higher price. So that includes all of the steps in turning uranium from dirt into energy. And it involves taking advantage of the associated industries that come with this and taking advantage of the profits that come with this. We do not want to be a country where mining companies come in, dig up the soil, remove it, do all the processing and all the refining and all the producing of energy outside, we end up with a hole and we take less than 10% of the value chain. We want to benefit jobs, associated industry, and profits. And we believe that we can do it, as does the International Atomic Energy Agency, in a way that has nothing to do with producing nuclear weapons. Our objective is energy and profit.
Tell me this, speaking of weapons, in the years past, we've often talked about how Saudi Arabia in the 70s and Russia just a few years ago was using energy as a weapon. In your mind, how vulnerable are we today in our energy systems? And I'm talking about whether it be the enormous amount of energy that AI, as we know, is going to require, whether it be just oil markets generally. How vulnerable are we today in our energy markets?
I don't believe, I wouldn't describe it as vulnerable. I would describe it as we are looking at an increase in demand that needs to be filled somehow. Because if it's not filled, then you're going to see a huge spike in prices. And AI and data centers require a lot of energy, and that energy has to come from somewhere. We in Saudi Arabia want to be a hub for these centers. We have the land. We want to be able to, we can produce that energy using renewable energy, solar energy, other energy, and we can do it efficiently. And we believe that given our geographic location, we can have the connectivity to be able to send it abroad. So this is one of the priorities for us. So I think that this is how I would look at it. In terms of oil weaponizing energy, we have maintained for many decades that oil is not a weapon. It's not
anymore.
It's not a weapon. You can't shoot it. You can't fire it. You don't take it to the battlefield. It's a commodity, and it's a precious commodity. It relies on supply and demand, sets the price. We want to be a responsible producer. We have been a swing producer where we try to keep the markets in balance as much as we can to reduce the massive fluctuations in the price of oil, so that it makes it easier for people to invest, to borrow money, and to return their investment, and also to plan long term. That provides stability for the global financial markets, which serves us because we are big investors and we are energy producers, and we want stability in the financial markets.
Yeah. Donald Trump is widely expected to visit Saudi Arabia in the near future. What kind of conversation do you want to have with him regarding energy and climate?
President Trump is most welcome in Saudi Arabia anytime he wants to come. And I think the conversations between Saudi Arabia and the United States, we have been allies, we have been partners for 80 years. We have huge interests, whether it's bilaterally in terms of trade, investment, in terms of cultural exchanges, in terms of students, in terms of whether it's regionally. We work very closely together on bringing peace and stability in a region, maintaining security in a region, whether it's globally, the same issue. We have very important relationships on technology, on energy, on investments. We are large investors in the U.S. economy. American companies are large investors in the Saudi economy. So it is a huge relationship, and it has many, many dimensions to it. And every time our two countries have worked closely together, they have been able to achieve great things, whether in terms of stability and security and peace regionally and globally, and in terms of prosperity for both countries when it comes to trade and investment issues.
There's a lot of speculation about what the U.S.-China relationship will be in the future. Saudi Arabia, of course, has a strong relationship both with the United States and, of course, with Beijing. How worried are you about the possibility that a trade war between the United States and China could derail your agenda as a country?
We have very strong relationships with both countries. Our relationship with the U.S. is a strategic relationship. China is our largest trading partner. We believe that stability in the global financial system and the global market serves everyone, and we hope that the two countries will be able to negotiate their differences, because a trade war does not serve the interests of either. And I believe that we have seen in the past that the two countries have been able to negotiate or resolve their issues and reach understandings through by discussing it rather than by turning it into trade wars.
Talk to me a little bit about the region when it comes to climate. Obviously, we see the UAE made a great deal of strides, obviously hosting COP28. In your mind, as Saudi looks forward to its own hosting of a COP, what are some of the things you're hoping that the region is able to achieve?
Our region, the Gulf region in particular, has done, I think, an outstanding job in terms of dealing with climate, the challenges of climate, as well as land degradation, as well as biodiversity. So the Rio Trio, the three COPs, we have invested tremendous resources in it, beginning with education and all the way to implementation. In Saudi Arabia, we have more than 70 initiatives domestically that deal with all of these issues. We have initiatives globally. I mentioned the Middle East Green Initiative. We established the Global Water Organization. That was an initiative by His Royal Highness the Crown Prince to bring clean water and how we use water more efficiently to as many people as possible. We are part of the Methane Pledge. We are involved with cleaning oceans, and we're involved with reversing pollution of plastics. We are involved in a lot of initiatives, and we have provided investments to many countries around the world to help them with resilience, to help them with beefing up infrastructure, to help them with desalination, to help them with on and on and on. We are doing a lot of things. We hosted COP16, the Earth COP, or the Land Degradation and Drought COP, and our objective was to raise the awareness level and highlight the link, the nexus between land degradation and security. If you have land degradation, people don't have food. They move to places where they can plant food. Chances are people live there. You have conflict, you have bloodshed, you have violence, you have extremism, you have terrorism, you have migration. The migrants end up in a country where there could be a reaction that leads to extremist politics. So when you look at extremist politics in Europe, you can trace its linkage to a particular place in Africa or in the Middle East. And you can trace the origins of that conflict to drought. You look at the countries in the Sahel, 90% of the Chad River evaporated since the 1960s. It created dislocations for millions of people who moved, created conflict, and then we're paying the price. Darfur, Sudan, has been engaged in a conflict for almost 40 years. And it started with drought, and it turned into a conflict, ethnic conflict, civil war. People are paying the price, and our objective is to highlight this to people, invest early in land restoration, and avoid the consequences that will cost us 50 times more to deal with than if we had dealt with it at the outset. And the irony of all of this is investing $1 in land restoration generates between $7 and $30 in profit. This is better than investing in high tech. Why don't people do it? And this is what we're trying to show people. And this is not an issue, land degradation, that concerns North Africa and the Middle East. Germany has a problem with the waters of the Rhine. Southern Europe has problems with drought. This is an issue that impacts everyone. Sweden gets dust from the Sahara Desert, as does Costa Rica. We get dust from as far away as the Chinese desert. Now, we have a lot around us. So this is a global issue, and it's straightforward to deal with. We just need to focus on it and get it done, and this is what we're trying to do in Saudi Arabia.
You may remember President Biden's Secretary of Defense, as well as the current Secretary of Defense in the United Kingdom, have cited climate change as their number one worry for the planet, their number one concern. Now that we have Trump in the White House, is climate your number one concern for the planet?
Ours?
Yeah.
I believe for everybody, the issue of climate change, the issue of whether it's too little water or too much water, the issue of rising temperatures, everybody acknowledges this.
But is it the number one concern facing us?
I think it certainly is. If it's not the number one, it is right up there, because it impacts everything. It impacts, for example, desertification, impacts the reflection of the sun, impacts weather patterns over the Atlantic, impacts the frequency and intensity of hurricanes in the Caribbean, impacts weather climates around the world. Dust can do the same thing. And also the climate issues can impact what happens in the oceans, and the oceans are our biggest reservoir for carbon. And that impacts, again, the rain patterns. And so it's a cycle that impacts everything we do, and it's linked to economic development, it's linked to wars and conflict, it's linked to prosperity. 800 million people on the planet are undernourished. The amount of land we can grow food on shrinks. Populations are rising. So we're heading towards conflict. We have to fix these issues. And I don't believe that anyone disagrees with this. I believe the differences have to do with what's the right way to move forward in tackling these issues. And I think that grandstanding and emotions and hypocrisy and threats and shaming and naming and finger pointing doesn't get us anywhere. Rolling up our sleeves and planting trees, redesigning our cities, investing in technology, investing in alternative sources of energy, pointing out the benefits and the profitability of that path is what will get people to move towards the right direction. And when we can deal with these issues, they will have a direct positive impact on security, which will then have an impact on stability and peace.
It's interesting, over the last several days leading up to his inauguration, Donald Trump talking about Greenland. I've spent a lot of time in Russia and Ukraine, as you know. And when we talk about climate and what's happening in the Arctic, the ice, surprise, surprise, is melting. That raises security concerns. Russia has the most military intelligence hardware in the Arctic, as well as oil and gas infrastructure, as you know. In your mind, are we living in dangerous times as a result of climate change?
I think we are always living in challenging times. The history, unfortunately, of mankind has been one of wars, not peace and stability. I believe that the conflicts may shift from one region or another depending on the century we live in, but war has been a constant in our history, unfortunately. I think we are moving towards a global society, a global village. I don't want to call it village, it's too big for a village, where we now recognize that something happening on one end of the world has a direct impact on something on the other end of the world, which we never had before. How long did it take to get mail from Europe to the United States 150 years ago? Now it takes a nanosecond to get pictures and voicemail and from the Amazon forest to Siberia because of technology. How long? So now we deal with the issues of that go beyond our borders, that impact all of us positively or negatively. COVID doesn't differentiate between male, female, between Muslim, Jew, Christian, between Asian, African, European. It doesn't differentiate. We are all its target. And unless we all work together to contain it, we can't. And we did work together, in spite of our differences. Maybe not ideal, but in a very effective way, to contain it and push back against it. So we are, in one hand, yes, business as usual, challenging world. You called it dangerous world, but also business as unusual, which is a recognition that we need to deal with each other to handle global issues like pandemics, like climate, like transportation, and that those issues can only be handled if we work together. So on one hand, you're seeing the world coming together much more closely than before, while at the same time we're the same in the sense of our tensions. And my hope, and I believe this is where we're heading, because I'm an optimist, is that as we learn and more, as we learn of the benefits that we get by working together, the side of the side of the equation that spells cooperation grows, and the side of the equation that spells conflict gets diminished. Because where does conflict get us? Nowhere. We can have conflict for 30 years and we'll be worse off than we were when we started. Whereas if we have cooperation, technology, artificial intelligence, trade, in 30 years we can be many, many times wealthier than where we are today. Which vision do you want? Going forwards and upwards, or going backwards and downwards?
Are we, as he says, safer, the world, with Donald Trump in the White House?
I don't see why people talk about this. I think, yes, the world is safer. The world is safer with anyone in the White House. The world is safer because the world is beginning to recognize that we need to work together. We need to deal with challenges that are beyond us as nations or as ethnic groups or as religious groups, and that we have to deal with problems or challenges or dangers as humanity, that we can't escape that. And I believe that we are beginning to do this, and we will continue to do more of this. And so I'm hopeful that our children and grandchildren will be living in a world that is more together and more calm and more prosperous and more healthy than the one we live in.
Your Excellency, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you.
At Al Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Arabiya News,
It's very impressive.
where knowledge meets perspective.
Shanghai. The most prosperous city in China, Shanghai. It is in fact the largest city, teeming with vigor and vitality. Shanghai may not be the typical destination, brimming with sightseeing venues, but it's definitely got a lot to offer and experience. For one, you can choose to cruise along the Huangpu River and stroll along the Bund. The Bund is known for its marvelous display of Shanghai's classic skyline views. You can also witness the rare treasures of the city at the Shanghai Museum. It has a vast collection of rare cultural relics, reaching up to 120,000 pieces on display. Most popular are its beautifully decorated bronzes, which reach up to 400 pieces. Want to see the city with a bird's eye view? Then head over the World Financial Center, the 5th tallest building in the world. It will give you the best elevated views in the Shanghai metropolitan. You can view the scenery from various floors, but a must-visit is the Skywalk, which is the world's highest observatory. This is perhaps the best spot you can be in the middle of Shanghai. It's definitely where you should be if you're watching the sunrise or the sunset. Now, for a dining experience you'll never forget, try the revolving restaurant at the famous Oriental Pearl TV Tower. The building is in fact an outstanding landmark, and the revolving hotel is a popular tourist destination. You can also view the Chinese metropolis from above through its space module, its highest observatory level set at 350 meters or 1,148 feet from above the ground. The attractive building has 3 legs, 11 spheres, and 15 observatory levels. Meanwhile, take a break from the city's modern wonders and stroll around in Zhujiajiao. Zhujiajiao Watertown offers a relaxing ambiance and view. You can opt to stroll around by foot or take the boat or a ferry ride to see and appreciate the rows of canals, bridges, and genius architecture in this old water town in Shanghai. One of the most popular is the Fangsheng Bridge. It is the largest arch bridge in Shanghai. Finally, complete your experience with a walking tour and shopping along Nanjing Road. It is the place to be to experience the hustle and bustle of Chinese trade.
From the White House to Gaza, Kyiv to Beijing, elections, economics, and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deepfake, and artificial intelligence,
they've got to have a vote and a say.
It's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers,
my campaign is going very well.
Presidents, prime ministers, princes and peacemakers, and cultural tastemakers.
As Arabs, as Middle